Chapter 1. F***CK. Heavenly Tribulation. The young man abruptly sat up on the bed and roared. Then, he started panting. Then, the young man suddenly opened his eyes wide and raised his hands in disbelief. Looking at his rosy palms full of vitality, his face was full of disbelief. What's going on? Shouldn't I have died in that apocalyptic heavenly tribulation? Why am I still alive? Clenching his hands, the young man still maintained that expression of disbelief. Then, he closed his eyes and recalled. He was the strongest person in the continent, the supreme swordsman known as the Tianji Sword Emperor Tianyang. When he had broken through to the Ascension realm, his swordsmanship had also broken through the shackles of the Sky Continent and reached an unprecedentedly powerful realm. Then, he had actually attracted that terrifying heavenly tribulation. Thinking of that heavenly tribulation, Tianyang's forehead couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. What kind of heavenly tribulation was that? It was clearly something used to slaughter living creatures. What powerful martial artists who had successfully ascended to the Ascension realm in the history books were fake, all fake. They were all special effects. Facing that kind of heavenly tribulation, how could anyone survive? But Tianyang looked at his body again. His black hair was a bit messy and draped over his back. Although his body wasn't strong, it wasn't thin either. Closing his eyes and sensing, Tianyang even faintly found a trace of true yuan. True yuan was the powerful energy cultivated in the Sky Continent and the source of energy for many self-cultivators. It was formed by absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. It could be said that whether it was the Tianji Sword Emperor, Tianyang, or this body, they were all familiar with this kind of energy. Extremely weak soul power spread out, trying to guide this true yuan. However, when his soul moved slightly, countless complex and disorderly memory fragments appeared one after another. Turned out that this body was also called Tianyang. However, unlike him, this Tianyang was a real piece of trash. Born in the Tian family, one of the 8 great families of the Blizzard State, and the son of the head of the Tian family. His status was very noble, and he had all kinds of cultivation resources. Moreover, this Tianyang was also very capable. In just 5 years after opening his meridians, he had cultivated from a mortal to the last of the 3 realms before entering the martial Tao. Essence refining, Qi refining, and essence refining were the 3 realms that one had to reach to enter the martial Tao. Essence refining was to control the essence Qi in one's body freely. Qi refining was to transform essence Qi into true Qi. Essence refining was to transform true Qi into true Qi. Once he reached this realm, he only needed to experience a martial spirit awakening to be able to step onto the martial path and become a true martial artist. However, it was precisely because the original owner of this body had not awakened his martial spirit that he was unable to enter the martial path. Even at the age of 15, he was still stuck in the basic realm of refining yuan. That was why he was called trash. This body, isn't it a little too weak? Martial spirit? What's that? Thinking of this, Tianyang suddenly looked puzzled. In his time, there was no such thing as a martial spirit. There were 3 realms before entering the martial Tao, but since when did entering the martial Tao require something like a martial spirit? It only needed to be guided by a cultivation method. Then, the next memory fragment merged. Tianyang couldn't help but sit up straight and open his eyes wide in disbelief. It's already 10,000 years later? And after I died under the heavenly tribulation, I actually came to the heaven continent 10,000 years later? I was reborn in this young man who has the same name as me? Tianyang murmured. His words were full of shock. His title was the Tianji Sword Emperor. He was a powerful existence at the peak of the heaven ascension state. However, he had never thought that there was such a thing as time travel in this world. And the reason why this world needed to awaken a martial spirit to step into the martial Tao was precisely because of the terrifying heavenly tribulation 10,000 years ago. It almost destroyed the entire world, and the cultivation system was completely destroyed. However, a new thing called the martial spirit was born. No cultivation method? Tianyang murmured. Then, he couldn't help but smile. No cultivation method, but I have a martial spirit. Now that I've reincarnated to the heaven continent 10,000 years later, I still remember that cultivation method in my mind. Divine Wilderness Heavenly Spirit Art. In his previous life, Tianyang had personally created a peerless cultivation method. In the entire heaven continent, there wasn't a powerful cultivation method that could compare to it. If I cultivate the Divine Wilderness Heavenly Spirit Art and have a martial spirit, then how strong would I be? Tianyang laughed loudly. Then, he continued to merge the next memory fragment. The great destruction of civilization? The heavenly tribulation that could make me, a peak heaven ascension state powerhouse, unable to resist was actually a terrifying heavenly tribulation that could destroy an entire civilization? Tianyang's history isn't bad. The Tianji Sword Emperor died under the first thunderbolt of the great destruction of civilization. Tianyang continued to merge the memory fragments, and the various memories of this body were also completely merged by him. In the end, Tianyang discovered that all the memories of this body from the age of 4 to the age of 15 had been completely merged by him. Who would have thought that in my past life, I would only become famous after breaking through to the heavenly completion stage. But now, because of a single bolt of heaven-damned lightning, I would be recorded in the history books of the heavenly firmament continent 10,000 years later. Tianyang grinned. Then, he slowly stood up. His eyes flickered with a cold light. This body, since this emperor has received your kindness and was reincarnated in this body, then I'll help you settle your hatred. First, this is the Lingyun sect. There's an enemy called Yang Dong. A wave of arrogance emanated from Tianyang's body. If other people who knew Tianyang saw the current Tianyang, they would probably widen their eyes in disbelief. This was because the current Tianyang was no longer the trash Tianyang from before, who was unable to condense a martial soul. Instead, he came from 10,000 years ago, the peak heaven ascension state powerhouse, who stood at the peak of the continent, the Tianji Sword Emperor Tianyang. I didn't see this body clearly, but it seems to be the 25th of January right now. In other words, the Lingyun sect's annual sacrificial ceremony is being held today. With this body's status as an outer disciple, it wouldn't have been a problem for him to participate in the sacrificial ceremony and condense a martial soul. Unfortunately, this Tianyang didn't manage to wait for the arrival of this day before he died. Tianyang sighed. He felt a trace of regret for the death of this body. He tidied up his clothes and combed his disheveled black hair. On the left chest of his pale white robe, the symbol of the Lingyun sect's outer disciple shone brightly. Tianyang looked at the delicate and pretty face in the mirror in front of him and laughed mischievously. Chapter 2. Walking on the main road of the Lingyun school, Tianyang fiddled with the Lingyun school mark on his chest from time to time. Because he was an outer disciple, the mark wasn't as luxurious as an inner disciple's. However, as long as he had this mark, he could participate in the annual worship ceremony and use the power of the worship ceremony to communicate with the gods. Of course, as a heavenly completion realm elite 10,000 years ago, Tianyang didn't really believe in the god. Communicating with the heavenly Tao was more or less the same. However, this was also a good opportunity for him to awaken his martial spirit. Hey, isn't this the famous trash of our Lingyun school? Why are you holding your head high now? Do you really think you can awaken your martial spirit at the worship ceremony? Suddenly, a sharp voice came from the side. Tianyang stopped what he was doing and turned his head strangely. When he saw the person's face, he knew who it was. His face was ordinary, but it carried a strange, evil aura. Like Tianyang, He was wearing the white outer disciple robe of the Lingyun school. Tianyang also remembered who this person was from his memory fragment. It was none other than Yang Dong, who was called one of the three trash of the Lingyun school. He was also the one who bullied and ridiculed this body the most. Hee hee. Tianyang smiled faintly and ignored Yang Dong's ridicule. He took a step forward and walked over with a calm face. He didn't care about Yang Dong at all. He was the Tianji Sword Emperor. If he cared about the ridicule of such a nobody, then what was the point of cultivating? When Yang Dong saw that Tianyang ignored him, his face became bewildered. This trash had been stuck in the refining realm all this time. He hadn't even awakened his martial spirit. Every time he saw him, he had a submissive appearance. Now, not only did he have a face full of confidence, but he also didn't care about him. Thinking of this, a trace of anger appeared on Yang Dong's face. Although he was also trash of the Lingyun school, he was definitely not someone that Tianyang, who hadn't even awakened his martial spirit, could provoke. Seems like you've become more arrogant after not seeing you for a few days. In that case, I'll teach you the rules on behalf of my senior brothers and sisters. Yang Dong shouted angrily. Then, a faint true essence surrounded his body. He stomped his feet, waved his fists, and rushed towards Tianyang. Mountain-breaking fist. A faint true essence suddenly condensed on Yang Dong's fist. He didn't even use his martial spirit. Tianyang turned around and glanced at Yang Dong disdainfully the moment Yang Dong made his move. His head, chest, left arm, his entire body was full of flaws. How could such a fist technique be called the mountain-breaking fist? Although I don't have enough Jinyuan, it's still enough to teach you a lesson. Tianyang chuckled. Then, he put two of his fingers together and aimed at Yang Dong's chest, which was his biggest weakness. He then stabbed with his finger. Bang! The true essence condensed on Yang Dong's fist instantly exploded. His face turned pale. He stood up in a sorry state. His body felt weak, and his face was full of disbelief. He knew about the weakness in his chest, but how could Tianyang know? Even if he knew, how could he break it? Looking at Yang Dong's appearance, Tianyang smiled again. Even if he was extremely useless and didn't have a trace of true essence, he had hundreds of ways to kill him. However, the most important thing now was the worship ceremony. Tianyang glanced at Yang Dong, whose fist technique had been broken by his finger. He didn't have the slightest intention of giving him any pointers. He quickened his pace and walked towards the worship ceremony. At this moment, Yang Dong suddenly took a few steps back. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Tianyang's true essence still remained in his body. It had only exploded now. Bastard! Yang Dong supported himself against the wall and looked at Tianyang with hatred. Then, he suppressed the injury on his chest and followed Tianyang. He wanted to see Tianyang embarrass himself in front of everyone at the worship ceremony because he couldn't awaken his martial spirit. Tianyang's residence was extremely remote. Although it was still within the soaring cloud sect's sphere of influence, it was still quite a distance away from the worship ceremony. However, Tianyang's cultivation base was at the essence refining realm, so it only took them a few minutes to reach the place where the ancestral ceremony would be held. This is the worship ceremony of the sect. Unrelated people are not allowed to enter. At the entrance of the venue, two guards saw Tianyang. After shouting this line, they put on a contemptuous expression. So it's the famous genius Tianyang. Hey, you're here to try your luck again. Then let's hurry up and go in. I hope that our great genius will have heaven-defying luck today and successfully awaken a trash martial spirit. Ahahaha! Faced with the guard's mockery, Tianyang's expression did not change at all. Instead, he responded with an indifferent gaze. As for the guards who mocked Tianyang, their mocking laughter stopped abruptly when they met Tianyang's gaze. What kind of gaze was that? It was as if there was an endless amount of slaughter and war contained within it, and it was extremely deep. Was this really a gaze that trash like Tianyang could display? Move. Tianyang calmly spat out 2 words. Before he finished speaking, the guard who met Tianyang's gaze unconsciously took a step back. When the guards beside him saw this, although they felt strange, they also took a step back. According to common sense, shouldn't this senior guard continue to humiliate Tianyang? Only when Tianyang walked into the venue and disappeared from the guard's sight did the guard who spoke let out a sigh of relief. That gaze just now was too terrifying. How could it be? The guard shook his head forcefully. How could that gaze belong to a trash like Tianyang? I must be thinking too much. Humph. He will make a fool of himself in the sect ceremony later. At this moment, Tianyang had already reached the center of the venue. The second segment, Martial Spirit Awakening. After waiting for about 10 minutes, the first segment, the Heaven and Earth Sacrifice, had ended and the second segment began. The moment he stepped into the venue, Tianyang suddenly raised his eyebrows. Previously, he sensed that there was nothing here. Now, after the Heaven and Earth Sacrifice, there was a mysterious aura. No wonder this body wanted to awaken its martial spirit at this time. So it was because of this aura. Tianyang praised. Then, he walked in front of the martial spirit awakening stone. The person who was holding this stone was a deacon of the sect. When he saw Tianyang, he sighed. Before he reached the age of awakening his martial spirit, Tianyang was a great genius. Who would have thought that he would be unable to condense his martial spirit? A genius died just like that. Circulate your true yuan and sense the surrounding heaven and earth spiritual qi. Resonate with the martial spirit awakening stone. Then, awaken your martial spirit. The middle-aged man said loudly. Hearing this, Tianyang nodded his head and placed his palm on top of the martial spirit awakening stone, which was sparkling and translucent like a crystal ball. The surrounding mocking, disdainful, and contemptuous gazes shot towards Tianyang. However, he ignored them all and circulated the true yuan in his body. Pain. Tianyang's pupils suddenly shrank for a moment. The surrounding heaven and earth spiritual qi also began to fluctuate. Tianyang hurriedly looked inside himself and saw that under the layers of his organs, his meridians were actually spiraling. Spiraling meridians were naturally crippled meridians. He would never be able to step onto the martial path. The true yuan shuttled through the spiraling meridians with difficulty. Every time it fluctuated, it would affect Tianyang's nerves. Why were spiraling meridians called naturally crippled meridians? This was because every time the spiraling meridians revolved, it would bring an incomparably terrifying pain to the body. This kind of pain was something that even a person who had stepped into the body refinement realm would not be able to endure, let alone a person who had yet to step onto the martial path. However, at this moment, Tianyang's eyes were not filled with despair, but ecstasy. In his previous life, he also had spiraling meridians, and the cultivation technique he cultivated, if it was not spiraling meridians, he would definitely not be able to cultivate it. Truly, the heavens are helping me. Tianyang could not help but let out a long cry in his heart. Unable to step onto the martial path? Born with crippled meridians? What a joke. Divine desolate heaven spirit art, out. The peerless cultivation technique in his mind directly led the true yuan in his body to circulate, and the waves of pain were transmitted to Tianyang's mind. As for Tianyang, he shouted loudly, Divine desolate heaven spirit art, first heaven, spirit absorption into the body, successfully cultivated. At this moment, when Tianyang had cultivated the divine desolate heaven spirit art to the first heaven and stepped onto the martial path, the martial spirit awakening stone suddenly erupted with a dazzling light. As for the sect deacon, when he saw this light, his initial sigh turned into incomparable shock. Chapter 3. Everyone stared with their eyes wide open after seeing the brilliant light. What was that? It was the light from the martial spirit awakening stone. It also represented the awakening of a martial spirit. Tianyang was only a waste-born with crippled meridians. He couldn't even enter the martial Tao. How could he awaken a martial spirit? At the end of the audience, Yang Dong's mouth was so wide open that it could fit a duck egg. He couldn't believe that Tianyang, who was born with crippled meridians, was able to condense a martial spirit. No, it's impossible. Yang Dong suddenly shook his head, but his eyes still couldn't get rid of that bright light. Even if Tianyang, that waste, awakened a martial spirit, it would at most be a low-grade yellow-rank trash martial spirit. Different people naturally had different martial spirits. Between different martial spirits, there would naturally be differences in quality. The quality of martial spirits was divided into 4 grades: heaven, earth, black, and yellow. Each grade was further divided into 3 subgrades: high, middle, and low. Heaven was the highest and yellow was the lowest. Normally, the outer court disciples of the Lingyun school would at least awaken a middle yellow rank martial spirit. However, Yang Dong and the other one of the 3 great trash of the Lingyun school had awakened a low yellow rank martial spirit. Otherwise, even if they were only at the first level of the body refinement realm, they wouldn't be called trash. The others also had faces of disbelief. Tianyang's reputation as one of the 3 waste of the outer sect was too famous. Even they had heard of him. In the end, he actually condensed a martial spirit? One had to know that Tianyang was born with crippled meridians. He couldn't even enter the martial Tao, let alone condense a martial spirit. If he could, how could he be humiliated by the other 2 waste of the outer sect? Tianyang didn't care about the reactions of the people outside. At this moment, his attention was completely attracted by the faint shadow that appeared from the martial spirit awakening stone. It seemed to be a sword, a long sword. Tianyang's eyebrows slightly twitched. This sword seemed familiar. In the next moment, an incomparably terrifying suction force burst out from Tianyang's palm, and the shadow in the martial soul awakening stone became incomparably clear. Then, true essence continuously gushed out from Tianyang's palm. It was as if Tianyang's right palm had turned into an incomparably terrifying whirlpool. The energy between heaven and earth madly converged towards Tianyang. Yang Dong and the others also stared fixedly at Tianyang's palm. Sword hilt, sword guard, sword blade, sword edge, sword tip. As the energy of the sky and earth gathered, a long sword condensed above Tianyang's palm. When he saw the hilt of this sword, Tianyang's pupils dilated to the extreme. Heavenly sword. This was a divine sword that he had spent half of his life refining when he was the Tianji Sword Emperor in his previous life. It had accompanied him for half of his life. 10,000 years ago, celestial clouds had been called celestial clouds. However, Tianyang had named his sword after the continent. This showed how powerful the heavenly sword was. However, when Tianyang encountered the calamity of civilization, the heavenly sword was directly pierced by lightning and disappeared from the world. Now, the heavenly sword had reappeared. Furthermore, it was Tianyang's martial soul. Heavenly sword, this is my heavenly sword. Tears seemed to be rolling in his eyes. To Tianyang, the heavenly sword was not just a simple weapon, but a good friend, a close relative. When the heavenly sword had been shattered, Tianyang's heart had been filled with incomparable pain. However, now, the heavenly sword had returned to Tianyang's side. It's actually a sword martial soul? The middle-aged deacon did not notice Tianyang's emotional fluctuations. Instead, he looked at the long sword in Tianyang's hand in astonishment and raised the martial soul awakening stone. The awakening stone, which was as clear as a crystal ball, slightly touched the tip of the sky firmament sword. Then, it emitted a layer of faint yellow light. What a pity! It took you so much effort to break your crippled meridians, but your martial soul is only a low-grade yellow-rank martial soul. The deacon looked at Tianyang with pity and shook his head. When Tianyang heard this, he smiled lightly. Low-grade yellow-rank martial soul? Not bad at all. After the heavenly sword had turned into a martial soul, it still retained the characteristics of the heavenly sword from his previous life. In his previous life, Tianyang had spent half of his life searching for rare metals in the world and fusing them into a furnace. In the end, he had obtained the heavenly sword. At first, the sky firmament sword was nothing more than a sword-shaped pitch-black metal. However, when Tianyang used it to kill his enemies, he discovered that the sky firmament sword had actually evolved a little from that pitch-black scrap metal. This discovery made Tianyang ecstatic. And now, the heavenly sword was the same. Ha 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 ha. Trash is trash. You were lucky enough to enter the martial Tao, but aren't you still trash? Low-grade yellow-rank martial soul. In any case, you are the son of the Tian family of the Snowstorm Nation. Who would have thought that your martial soul would only be a low-grade yellow-rank martial soul? At this moment, an arrogant laugh came from the audience. When Tianyang heard this, he naturally recognized the source of the voice. It was Yang Dong, who had been knocked down by his fist on the road. Turning his head, he saw Yang Dong looking at him with an arrogant face. It was as if he had already broken through to the second level of the body refinement realm. Trash is trash. I only awakened a martial soul that isn't too good, and you are already so arrogant. Didn't your parents teach you what manners are? Tianyang smiled faintly. The words that came out of his mouth stunned the audience. They couldn't believe their ears. What did they just hear? Tianyang, a person who had just awakened a low-grade yellow-rank martial soul, actually dared to provoke Yang Dong, who had been in the first level of the body refinement realm for a long time and had also awakened a martial soul for a long time. Although both of their martial souls were of the same grade, Tianyang, a person who had just entered the martial Tao, actually dared to scold Yang Dong? Yang Dong obviously didn't expect Tianyang to actually dare to talk back. For a moment, he actually didn't react. When he finally reacted, his originally pale face actually surged with a layer of furious red. Tianyang. Traces of true yuan exploded from Yang Dong's body. Yang Dong's eyes were scarlet red as he stared fixedly at Tianyang, who had a faint smile on his face. He clenched his fists so tightly that blue veins popped out. Tianyang, this trash who had just awakened a trash martial soul, actually dared to provoke him during the sex sacrificial ceremony. Didn't he just awaken a trash martial soul? He, Yang Dong, was not the same. He could still kill him like before. What are you shouting for? I didn't forget my name. Or are you saying that you are gay? Tianyang smiled, but his words shocked the crowd once again. When some of the younger disciples heard this, their gazes towards Yang Dong changed. Could it be that this guy was really gay? Hearing this, Yang Dong's pupils contracted once again. Traces of cold air seeped out from the gaps of his teeth. In his heart, he had already sentenced Tianyang to death. I know that you, Yang Dong, have always found me an eyesore. You even want to kill me. Tianyang's eyes flickered with a shrewd light as he smiled faintly. Then, I will give you a chance now. Chapter 4. Now I will give you a chance. Do you want to fight or not? Tianyang's words, which contained a faint smile, resounded through the entire arena. Hearing this, the faces of the surrounding people froze. They looked at the smiling Tianyang in disbelief. This Tianyang, who had just awakened a low-grade yellow-ranked martial spirit, dared to challenge Yang Dong, who was at the first level of the body refinement realm. Even inviting him to a battle? Is this Tianyang crazy? He just stepped into the martial Tao. His foundation might not even be stable, yet he dares to challenge Yang Dong? Isn't he afraid that Yang Dong will shatter the true yuan he spent so much effort to condense and force him to return to the body refinement realm? The crowd couldn't help but whisper. Tianyang naturally heard it, but he didn't take it to heart. It was precisely because the reputation of this body as a trash had spread far and wide that he needed to defeat Yang Dong to get rid of the reputation of being a trash. After all, He had had enough of the disdainful looks that had brought him shame in his previous life. Arrogant. The veins on Yang Dong's forehead bulged. He didn't expect this trash, Tianyang, to be so arrogant before. Now, he even dared to challenge him. Since you want to die, I will send you on your way. At this point, the sex worship ceremony was almost over. Other than Tianyang, there were a few people who had awakened their martial spirits with the help of the divine spirit. Therefore, the middle-aged deacon didn't stop Tianyang's actions. He wanted to see what Tianyang, who had broken through the limits of the spiral meridians and awakened a low-grade yellow-ranked martial spirit, was relying on to be so arrogant. Based on Tianyang's previous performance, the middle-aged deacon didn't dare to assume that Tianyang was too excited. Taking a step back, Yang Dong suddenly rushed forward. The true yuan of the first level of the body refinement realm was attached to his feet, causing his speed to surpass that of a mortal. In the next moment, he arrived at the arena. I will let you know that trash will always be trash. You were just lucky before. Yang Dong shouted angrily. Hearing this, the crowd was slightly stunned. Could it be that Tianyang had fought with Yang Dong before? Moreover, from the meaning of these words, it seemed that Yang Dong was the one who had suffered a loss. Luck? Upon hearing this, Tianyang grinned. Then, he turned around and said to the middle-aged deacon, "Can you remove all unrelated personnel from the venue?" "Of course." The deacon nodded his head. Then, he led the people who had just awakened their martial souls and took a few steps back, leaving the field. "I wonder, what is the reason for you to challenge Yang Dong?" No one answered him. At this moment, the true essence within Yang Dong's body began to slowly revolve. In the next moment, his aura climbed to the peak. I've already stayed at the first level of the body refinement stage for more than a year. The depth of my accumulation is not something that trash like you who has just stepped into the martial Tao can compare to. If you admit defeat now, break your own legs, kneel in front of me and admit your mistake, I will spare your life. Looking at Tianyang, whose white robe fluttered in the wind and whose face was calm, Yang Dong laughed sinisterly. Hearing this, Tianyang's eyes narrowed slightly. Break my own legs, kneel in front of me and admit my mistake? Ridiculous. Sword come. Tianyang snorted coldly. He stretched out his hand and his weak true essence moved the ordinary steel sword that was placed at the side of the field. At this moment, the Sky Cloud sword was only a low-grade yellow-ranked martial soul. It was far from being able to condense into a physical form. Yang Dong's martial soul was the same. However, he would never be able to condense it into a physical form. On the other hand, Tianyang would be able to do so sooner or later. Using a sword? Yang Dong was slightly stunned. He had never heard of Tianyang using a sword before. However, since his martial soul was a sword, it was normal for him to use a sword. Iron shattering fist. Yang Dong's true essence revolved violently. In the next moment, his body rushed forward. The weak true essence condensed in Yang Dong's hand. Then, he directly arrived in front of Tianyang. It's the iron shattering fist. Although it's called a trash martial art, Tianyang has just entered the martial Tao. How can he learn martial arts? Is this Tianyang going to be defeated in one move? The crowd couldn't help but cry out in alarm. Yang Dong's lips curled into a sneer when he heard this. Then, his fist, which was covered in true origin, blasted viciously towards Tianyang's face. Martial arts? I don't know any, but I know the basic sword technique, vertical slash. The corners of Tianyang's mouth curled up. He calmly looked at the fist that was getting bigger and bigger in his line of sight. Then, his Sky Cloud sword was attached to the steel sword in his hand. He raised it up high and slashed downward. A beautiful straight line appeared in Yang Dong's line of sight. In the next moment, the vertical slash actually landed on the weak point of his iron-shattering fist. A trace of blood spurted out. What's going on? After his iron-shattering fist was broken, Yang Dong hurriedly retreated a few steps. He looked at his bleeding fist in disbelief. This Tianyang actually hit his weak point so accurately? How is this possible? It must be a coincidence. This trash Tianyang's luck is pretty good. However, the iron-shattering fist from before was just a warm-up. Yang Dong sneered. Then, he condensed his true essence and stomped on the ground. He charged towards Tianyang again. Rock-shattering palm. Tianyang smiled slightly. The steel sword in his hand once again slashed horizontally. Basic sword technique, horizontal slash. The weak point of his palm was once again broken by Tianyang's sword. In an instant, Yang Dong's right palm was completely covered in blood. A tearing pain spread throughout Yang Dong's body. Yang Dong's face suddenly turned sinister. You actually dared to injure me. Well then, Tianyang, don't think that you will have a complete ending today. Martial Soul, Glove. Yang Dong roared. Hearing this, Tianyang's eyes slightly narrowed. This glove martial soul seemed to be slightly stronger than his sky firmament sword. After all, he was someone who had stepped into the first level of the body refinement realm for a long time. At the same time, he also felt the sky firmament sword martial soul on the steel sword in his hand begin to stir. It was like a starving lion that had encountered a plump lamb. Glove martial soul combined with the mountain-shattering fist. Tianyang, you're dead. With a wild laugh, the incomparably illusory glove shadows covered Yang Dong's left and right fist. In the next moment, the mountain-shattering fist, which was enough to defeat anyone in the first level of the body refinement realm, arrived in front of Tianyang. Tianyang finally couldn't help but laugh out loud. Then, Tianyang flipped his wrist and suddenly changed his stance. His right foot took a step forward and the steel sword pierced out. Basic sword technique, straight step stab. What? Yang Dong's pupils constricted. This stab was actually aimed at his weak point. However, in the face of absolute strength, so what if you see through my weakness? You're still going to die. True essence crazily condensed and the glove martial soul became brighter and brighter. Tianyang's sword also suddenly pierced out. True essence directly condensed at the tip of the sword. It wasn't much, but the pure true essence brought by the divine desolate sky spirit art condensed into a point, which brought about an incomparably terrifying penetrative power. Bang! The mountain-shattering fist was directly pierced through by this stab. The so-called absolute strength was broken by Tianyang in the next second after it was released. Absolute strength? Ridiculous. With a faint smile, Tianyang looked at Yang Dong, who was planning to use his movement technique to escape. Once again, his sword stabbed out. Basic sword technique, immortal shows the way. Then, the steel sword pierced through all the changes in Yang Dong's movement technique and directly aimed at Yang Dong's forehead. As long as Tianyang moved forward a little, then Yang Dong would. Chapter 5. In just a few short moves, all of them were the most basic fundamental sword technique. Tianyang, on the other hand, had relied on this basic sword skill to break Yang Dong's martial spirit and martial arts, even when his true yuan was extremely weak and his martial spirit had just awakened. He had even used a fine steel sword that could be seen at any time. Looking at the extremely dangerous distance between them, everyone in the spectator stands couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. They couldn't take their eyes off Tianyang, who had a smile on his face, and Yang Dong, whose legs were trembling like a sieve. Was this really Tianyang, one of the three trash of the Soaring Cloud sect's outer sect? Even the middle-aged deacon's eyes couldn't help but flicker with a strange light as he looked at the fine steel sword that was still pointed at Yang Dong's glabella. Even he couldn't display such a skill. Could it be that Tianyang was really a genius of the Tian family, one of the 8 great families of the Blizzard State? Could it be that he didn't step into the martial path for a long time to condense his martial spirit because he wanted to accumulate strength? However, his naturally crippled meridians and spiral meridians were definitely not fake. Tianyong, who had been defeated by Yang Dong and the others until he was a good-for-nothing, had suddenly turned into a genius who looked down on everyone. Genius? Thinking of this word, the audience shook their heads. How could it be? Tianyong had just stepped into the martial path. He might not even be at the first level of the body refinement realm. So what if he could defeat Yang Dong? Everyone present, as long as they were at the third level of the body refinement realm, could defeat Yang Dong in a few moves like Tianyong. Although they might not be able to defeat Yang Dong as easily as Tianyong, it was as if he was taking a stroll. Thinking of this, the audience once again looked at Tianyong with a mocking gaze. However, their gazes didn't last for long before they were once again stunned and shocked. What was going on? Why did it feel like Tianyong had an extremely terrifying aura? It was fierce and overbearing, but it wasn't annoying at all. However, this aura suddenly disappeared as soon as it was detected by the audience. It made the audience think that it was just an illusion. Of course, it wasn't an illusion. In his previous life, Tianyong was the strongest person in the continent, the Tianji Sword Emperor. Although he was killed by the heavenly tribulation and reincarnated as a trash who had just awakened his martial spirit, the domineering aura of an emperor had never disappeared. An emperor was the king of the entire heaven continent. Only those who stood at the peak of the continent could be called emperor. And the pressure of an emperor's aura, not to mention these mortals who were only at the body refinement realm, or even the body refinement realm's light qi and Huayuan realm couldn't withstand it. Of course, Tianyong's emperor's soul, who was at the peak of the peak heaven realm in his previous life. Unless it was a critical moment, from his previous life's critical moments, critical moment. Heavenly emperors peak emperor peaks emperor heaven peak heavens peak emperors peak emperor peak heavens, and in peak his peaks peak and peak emperors was. After all, this body was really too weak. Tianyong smiled faintly as he looked at Yang Dong, whose legs had gone soft. If not for the fact that he was afraid that the incomparably sharp fine steel sword would behead him if he fell down, Tianyong put away the fine steel sword in his hand. However, before he could put it into his waist, Tianyong suddenly reacted. He awkwardly turned his head and said to the middle-aged deacon, "Deacon, can you give me a scabbard?" Previously, he had summoned the fine steel sword with a wave of his hand, but he had forgotten to bring the scabbard. Although the fundamental sword technique was the foundation, in the process of using it, it still consumed some true qi. If it was in his previous life, relying on the strength of the divine wilderness sky spirit technique, the true qi consumed would be completely replenished by the tyrannical cultivation technique before the sword could be used. But now, his body could be said to be incomparably weak. He had just stepped into the body refinement realm and didn't know if he had even reached the first level. However, Tianyong knew that his true qi was no longer enough to summon another scabbard. Oh! At this moment, the middle-aged deacon was also shocked by Tianyong's simple and unadorned posture, as if he had tempered the sword thousands of times. It wasn't until a few seconds after Tianyong spoke that he reacted. He took a scabbard from the side and threw it to Tianyong. "Many thanks." Tianyong smiled. With a kacha sound, the fine steel sword in his hand was put into the scabbard. Although his martial soul, the heavenly sword, was extremely powerful in his previous life, in this life, it had once again become like a piece of scrap metal. Even if he used it, he could only rely on a solid longsword. He couldn't condense it into a solid form to fight. From another point of view, the current heavenly sword was even worse than the heavenly sword in his previous life. It was just that, when he had pierced through the glove on Yang Dong's hand, Tianyong had clearly felt that his heavenly sword seemed to have become a little bit stronger. If it weren't for his spiritual strength at the peak of the heavenly completion realm, Tianyong wouldn't have been able to discover this. However, although it had only become a little bit stronger, it was enough to make Tianyong overjoyed. This meant that his martial soul, the heavenly sword, was just like the one in his previous life. It had the characteristic of continuously evolving. What's wrong? After retrieving the heavenly sword from the fine steel sword, Tianyang glanced at Yang Dong. Suddenly, he felt something. His complexion changed greatly, and he hastily retreated a few steps. At this moment, a foul stench came from Yang Dong's crotch. Seeing this, Tianyang almost couldn't help but vomit. The middle-aged deacon's expression also became unsightly. This Yang Dong had actually been so frightened by Tianyang's sword that he lost control of his bowels. What a disgrace! With an angry expression, the middle-aged deacon didn't wait for the filthy thing to fall to the ground. He waved his hand, and a tyrannical true origin exploded from his palm, sending Yang Dong flying. This was the sex sacrificial ceremony. If such a filthy thing contaminated the ceremony and offended the gods, what kind of punishment would that be? Seeing that Yang Dong had been sent flying, Tianyang turned around and said to the deacon, "Deacon, if there's nothing else, I'll take my leave." Hearing this, the middle-aged deacon was slightly startled. Then, he nodded his head. Seeing this, Tianyang turned around and walked toward the entrance he had come from. Looking at Tianyang's lonely and frail figure, the middle-aged deacon suddenly had a feeling that the person who left wasn't the trash who had just condensed a low-grade Huang-ranked martial soul, Tianyang, but a peerless expert. What's wrong with me today? Why do I keep having this illusion? Shaking his head, the middle-aged deacon was also shocked by his own thoughts. Then, he continued to preside over the unimportant closing segment. As for those who hadn't reacted yet, a trace of disgust appeared on their faces when they saw Yang Dong in the corner, whose crotch was yellow and wet. Then they were shocked. This Tianyang, one of the three trash of the outer court, actually used a basic sword skill to beat up Yang Dong? Furthermore, his cultivation isn't even at the first level of the body refinement realm? These two exclamations were like 1,000 ripples. Everyone suddenly came to a realization. For a moment, the entire audience fell into a state of shock. Chapter 6. Who would have thought that this body's misery would far exceed my imagination? Just like when he had just been reborn, Tianyang looked at his own palm and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. Using the explosive power that came with stepping into the martial way, he had also successfully stepped into the first level of the refinement realm. The current refinement realm was called the refinement realm in Tianyang's era 10,000 years ago. However, it was divided into 9 levels, and each level strengthened the body in order to build a foundation for the absorption of spiritual qi from heaven and earth. Thus, the so-called refinement realm was actually just a different name. Tianyang also very quickly accepted this name. However, what caused the corners of his mouth to twitch wasn't the name of the realm, but the situation that he saw when he stepped into the first level of the refinement realm and focused his inner vision previously, because Tianyang had yet to step into the martial way and was only at the basic level of the refinement realm. The true yuan in his body was so thin that it was difficult to detect it. Thus, even if he used inner vision, he could only do it for a short while. Now, if Tianyang wanted to use inner vision, he could do it for 10 minutes at a time. In the 3 to 4 minutes of inner vision, he could see the exact situation of the spiral meridians at a glance. The spiral state was like a spiral staircase. It was different from normal people who only had one set of meridians. The spiral meridians were 2 sets of meridians entangled in a spiral. If there wasn't a suitable method to deal with it, not only would it bring about immense pain when circulating true yuan, there was also a small possibility that the meridians would explode when circulating true yuan. The complete version of the spiral meridians are completely natural waste meridians. Even when I was in the past, I only had an incomplete version. The rarity of the complete version of the spiral meridians is even greater than that of those strong physique. The spiral meridians weren't just one type. In Tianyang's previous life, he had the ordinary incomplete version of the spiral meridians. Although it still brought about immense pain, it still gave him a chance to step into the martial way. As for the complete version of the spiral meridians, let alone entering the martial Tao, even when circulating quintessential essence, there was a possibility of it exploding occasionally. Tianyang's luck was considered good. He had cultivated to the essence refinement realm and had not exploded even once. Tianyang smacked his lips. His divine desolate heaven spirit technique was designed for his spiral meridians. However, because the degree of completeness of the spiral meridians was different, when he first stepped into the martial way, the divine desolate heaven spirit technique and the complete version of the spiral meridians weren't completely compatible. If Tianyang didn't discover it and continue cultivating, there would be a day when the accumulation of incompatibility would explode and turn him into ashes. Thinking of this, Tianyang let out a sigh of relief. However, for the Tianji Sword Emperor, as long as he discovered the problem, it wouldn't be a problem. Although many of the techniques that he came into contact with in his previous life were sealed because he was afraid of exploding his weak body, he could still think of some techniques that could make up for the incompatibility. Among them, there was one technique that could be said to be the easiest to find. Perhaps he could even find it in the Lingyun sect's outer sect. However, the refinement realm's requirements for the meridians aren't too high. It's still mainly about tempering the body. Then, let's cultivate for a while. In a few days, it will be the time to receive the monthly resources. Tianyang said softly. Then, he went outside the room. In the courtyard, he stood in front of the scarecrow that had been punched and kicked countless times by the previous owner of this body. Then, he slowly circulated the true yuan in his body and punched out. Ha! Tianyang shouted loudly. It was different from the careless attitude he had when he was fighting Yang Dong. Now, he was cultivating. When it came to cultivation, there was no room for carelessness. The punch was simple and unadorned, but it contained some profound techniques that ordinary people would not be able to comprehend. It landed on the sturdy straw doll, and the soft but tough straw counteracted most of the impact. However, the corners of Tianyang's mouth curled up slightly. The true yuan in his body fluctuated as if it was resonating with something. Then, the grass in front of him scattered in all directions. Bang! A dull sound exploded from the body of the scarecrow. In an instant, the scarecrow that had blocked Tianyang's punch turned into a pile of grass from the inside out. The true yuan that Tianyang had used was not wasted at all. If the middle-aged deacon was here to watch Tianyang cultivate, he would probably be so shocked that he would jump up and down. He would be amazed by Tianyang. Not to mention the hidden force that made the scarecrow explode, the power that was not wasted at all in the punch, and the perfect use of true yuan, were enough to make the middle-aged deacon and the others sigh in admiration. This was the foundation of the Tianji Sword Emperor. Even if a heavenly completion stage powerhouse was reborn into this trash's body, he was still far from being comparable to an ordinary person. Not bad. Although I haven't used it for decades, this Tong Ming fist is not the least bit rusty. Looking at the grass in front of him, Tianyang smiled with satisfaction. Tong Ming fist was a set of fist techniques that had been widely spread in the heaven continent 10,000 years ago. It had the miraculous effect of strengthening the body. Even if it was used as a martial skill, it would still be extraordinary. Back then, Tianyang had coincidentally broken through the shackles of the spiral meridians. After obtaining the Tong Ming fist, he had relied on his incomparable talent and improved it time and time again to make the Tong Ming fist incomparable to anyone else. It could be said that in the heaven continent 10,000 years ago, there had really been a reclusive old monster that was stronger than him, the Tianji Sword Emperor. However, when it came to the Tong Ming fist, he was absolutely invincible. Tianyang had a special feeling towards the Tong Ming fist, which was practically the symbol of the beginning of his martial path. Therefore, even if he was known as the Sword Emperor, he still practiced the Tong Ming fist at the first opportunity. Of course, the Tong Ming fist was also an important factor in the cultivation of the body refining stage. Apart from the complete spiral meridians, which are naturally useless meridians, this body's physical strength is also very weak. If I don't make up for it in the body refining stage, it will still have a big impact on my future martial path. Rubbing the joints of his wrist, Tianyang felt a faint pain from the Tong Ming fist that had bombarded the scarecrow. He had expected better from Tong Ming fist and sighed. However, as soon as he finished speaking, a trace of a smile appeared on his face. However, there is still about a week's time until the end of the month to receive the cultivation resources. If I practice the Tong Ming fist every day, then the weakness of my physical strength will be quickly made up for. 10,000 years ago, when he improved the Tong Ming fist, it wasn't just a simple improvement. With a special feeling, Tianyang strengthened all aspects of the Tong Ming fist. He didn't have the opportunity to use the Tong Ming fist. He didn't expect that 10,000 years later, an unintentional action from his previous life would be of great help to him. Chapter 7. 5 days later, Tianyang walked out of his residence. Strangely enough, Yang Dong did not come looking for trouble with him even once in these 5 days. One must know that before he was reincarnated into this body, Yang Dong had treated this body as a punching bag. Every now and then, he would team up with another genius to humiliate this body. But now, let alone looking for trouble, not even a single strand of hair had appeared within a radius of 100 meters. He's just a clown. Shaking his head, he threw Yang Dong, that trash, to the back of his mind. To the Tianji Sword Emperor, Yang Dong was just a short-lived trash. There was no need to pay attention to him. Tidying up his Lingyun outer sect robe, Tianyang slowly walked towards the main hall in the center of the outer sect according to the route in his memory fragment. The cultivation main hall was the name of the place Tianyang was going to. As the name suggested, it was a main hall that provided cultivation resources. Every month, outer sect disciples could obtain a certain amount of cultivation resources from the cultivation main hall. This was also the significance of establishing a sect. It allowed one to obtain stable and lasting cultivation resources. Otherwise, one might as well cultivate at home instead of joining a sect. However, in Tianyang's memory fragments, the last time this body went to the cultivation main hall was 5 months ago. Furthermore, he did not obtain any cultivation resources and was robbed for nothing. That person's name was Bai Xiang. He was an outer sect disciple with average talent and was at the 3rd level of the body refinement realm. If that was the case, he would not have the guts to rob a Lingyun sect disciple of his cultivation resources. Even if that disciple was one of the 3 great trash, it would still be the same. However, behind Bai Xiang was his older brother, Bai Lu, who was one of the few geniuses in the Lingyun sect's outer sect and was at the 6th level of the body refinement realm. Not to mention that this body originally only had a shallow cultivation of the body refinement realm. Even those at the 3rd level of the body refinement realm would not dare to provoke him. Therefore, relying on his older brother's prestige, Bai Xiang was also a tyrant in the outer sect. Other than those at the 3rd level of the body refinement realm and above, everyone else's cultivation resources would be exploited by him. Yang Dong and the other piece of trash were still fine, as he would only take 70% to 80% of their cultivation resources. However, Tianyang was the weakest of the 3 pieces of trash, so Bai Xiang would naturally not be courteous. He would directly seize all of his cultivation resources. Tianyang despised people who relied on their connections to intimidate others. In his previous life, he was upright and upright. Even if he was fighting for resources, he would not use such underhanded means. Therefore, even if he did not need cultivation resources, he still had to make a trip to the cultivation main hall. At that time, Bai Xiang directly gave Tianyang a ban. From then on, if he stepped into the cultivation hall, he would break one of his legs. After being threatened by Bai Xiang, The original owner of this body did not dare to approach the cultivation hall for the past 5 months. In the end, he did not obtain a single cultivation resource until he died. In the end, he was reborn by the current Tianyang. This time, I think I'll be able to encounter it. The Tong Ming fist is not just an ordinary fist technique. Its power is also not bad. Tianyang drew back the corners of his mouth, revealing his white teeth. However, that trace of coldness was never concealed. After coming to this world, these hands have never been stained with blood. Then, let's start with that Bai Xiang. To be able to be called an emperor, none of them were merciful people. He, the Tianji Sword Emperor, was no exception. Tianyang's residence was not close to the cultivation main hall. However, with the assistance of the Tong Ming fist, Tianyang reached the 4th level of the body refining realm in just 5 days. His physical attributes were much stronger than before. Therefore, Tianyang only used less than 3 minutes to travel 1 to 2 miles to arrive at the entrance of the majestic cultivation main hall. The cultivation main hall. The main hall was extremely majestic. There were 3 levels, each level was 5 meters high. The first level was for honorary disciples to receive cultivation resources. The second level was for outer sect disciples. The third level was for outer sect disciples. As for inner sect disciples, they naturally had the inner sect cultivation main hall. Naturally, they would not be interested in the things here. Bai Xiang's elder brother, Bai Lu, who indulged in his tyrannical behavior, was on the 3rd level to receive his cultivation resources. Because today was the day for outer sect disciples to receive their cultivation resources, the cultivation main hall, which was usually deserted, was now bustling with people. Isn't this Tianyang? Why does he still dare to come here? Could it be that there's something wrong with his brain? A few people who were clear about the situation 5 months ago looked at Tianyang in surprise and sneered. The outer sect's 3 great trash was not made up by a small group of outer sect disciples. That was a title recognized by all outer sect disciples. And now, as one of the 3 great trash, Tianyang actually ignored Bai Xiang's threat 5 months ago and came to the cultivation main hall? Hearing this, Tianyang's expression did not change. He stepped on the steps in front of the door, glanced at the person who spoke, and then stepped into the cultivation main hall. As for the person who had received his cultivation resources and was about to leave, when Tianyang glanced at him, it was as if his heart had stopped beating for a second. When he finally recovered, his back was soaked in cold sweat. You can be proud at this time. Right now, Bai Xiang hasn't come yet. When he comes, you'll have to obediently hand over the cultivation resources you received. Who knows, maybe you won't be able to keep your legs. Fiercely looking at Tianyang's back, that person gritted his teeth and followed him into the cultivation main hall. He wanted to see how Tianyang would make a fool of himself. Ignoring the various gazes of the crowd, Tianyang smiled indifferently. If he even cared about these things, then he was not worthy of being called the Tianji Sword Emperor. Show your outer sect disciple identification before you can receive your cultivation resources. Hearing the footsteps in front of him, the young disciple in charge of registration said without raising his head. Hearing this, Tianyang nodded and handed his outer sect disciple identification to the young disciple. The young disciple took it and looked at it. He was instantly stunned. Tianyang. That familiar name shocked the young disciple. Thinking that it was someone else with the same name, he raised his head to take a look. That face was undoubtedly Tianyang, one of the 3 great trash of the outer sect. You actually dare to come here? The young disciple said in surprise. Then, the corner of his mouth curled up into an undetectable smile. He waved his hand, and an outer sect disciple beside him handed over a box. Here, your cultivation resources, 2 blood chi pills. The young disciple chuckled, and the sarcasm in his words was undisguised. After knowing that Tianyang was the trash Tianyang, his attitude took a sharp turn. Hearing this, Tianyang frowned slightly. It was not because of the young disciple's attitude, but because, according to the sect rules, outer sect disciples' monthly cultivation resources are 5 blood chi pills and 1 low-grade spirit stone. Why is it 2 blood chi pills when it comes to you? Chapter 8. The chi blood pill was an item used to replenish chi and was one of the 9-grade pills. At the same time, it was an essential cultivation resource for body refinement cultivators. Body refinement cultivators naturally consumed a lot of chi and blood in their bodies. Even though Tianyang had rich cultivation experience in his previous life, he was still unable to break free from this shackle. As for the Tong Ming fist, it was the best body refinement fist technique and offensive fist technique. In terms of the consumption of chi and blood, it was already perfect. Otherwise, with Tianyang's current weak body, how could he cultivate for 5 days? However, after 5 days, his cultivation had reached body refinement stage level 4. However, he had also consumed about 70 to 80% of the chi and blood in his body. If he continued to cultivate, he would not be able to improve at all. If he had reached the 5th level of the body refinement realm, he would still be able to use some of the techniques from his previous life. However, this body of his was really too pitiful. Even after exhausting all of his chi and blood to the lowest level, he was still only at the 4th level of the body refinement realm. Therefore, these 5 chi blood pills were extremely important to Tianyang. In the end, the fellow in front of him actually dared to embezzle his cultivation resources? Thinking of this, Tianyang's eyes suddenly turned cold. Daring to embezzle the Tianji Sword Emperor's cultivation resources? This kind of action was no different from courting death. Bang! The counter made of special wood was instantly pressed by Tianyang, causing slender and obvious cracks to appear. However, the muscles on Tianyang's right arm did not even tense up. It was as if he had only pressed lightly. Seeing this scene, the young disciple's pupils contracted and his face turned pale. He looked in disbelief at the counter in front of him that he could not even make a small dent even after using all of his strength. No matter how hard he tried, he could not even leave a scratch on the counter. However, Tianyang, this trash, had just pressed lightly and caused cracks to appear on it? He was at body refinement stage level 2. To be able to do this, Tianyang had probably reached body refinement stage level 3, or even level 4. How was this possible? I took it. Do you have a problem with that? Before Tianyang could continue to speak, a sudden and arrogant voice came from the stairs. Tianyang turned his head, and his eyes recovered a little, but it was still enough to make people feel as if they had fallen into an ice cellar. His black hair could grow extremely long, but his face was undoubtedly a man's face, making him look extremely awkward. As if he was showing off, the man shook his head as he walked, causing his hair to fly in the air. Even the soaring cloud sect's outer sect emblem on his chest was blocked. The part of his face that was not covered by his hair was filled with arrogance. Tianyang instantly recognized that this person was Bai Xiang, who had forced this body not to come to the cultivation hall. Oh, I was wondering who it was. I didn't expect it to be that useless Tianyang. What's wrong? Do you think your legs are too long? You came to the cultivation hall and wanted me to do it for you? Looking at Tianyang with disdain, Bai Xiang walked past the crowd and came to the front of the young disciple. He took away the box that should have belonged to Tianyang. Trash will always be trash. Seeing your own cultivation resources being taken away, you still remain silent. However, do you think you can escape the punishment of breaking your legs like this? Bai Xiang did not immediately put away the box. He turned around and looked at Tianyang, who had a calm expression, and mocked him. Tianyang, on the other hand, was expressionless. Looking at Bai Xiang in front of him, there was no fluctuation in his heart. He even wanted to laugh. The coldness in the depths of his eyes also turned into a playful expression. Then, his lips slightly opened and he spat out 4 words. Barking wildly. His voice was not loud, but it was extremely clear. The surrounding people were all dumbfounded. Tianyang was provoking Bai Xiang? After hearing these 4 words, Bai Xiang's face suddenly turned ugly. The veins on his forehead bulged, and his true yuan surged. I thought you were finally sensible, but I didn't expect you to be so rude. Since that's the case, I'll break your legs now. Wave-breaking fist. His true yuan was like the waves of the sea, condensing on top of Bai Xiang's fist. Hearing this, Tianyang did not even lift his eyelids. He casually stretched out his hand, and his true yuan vibrated slightly. The wave-like true yuan was directly dispersed. You can break the waves like this? I'm afraid you're just a small splash of water. Smiling slightly, Tianyang did not wait for Bai Xiang to react. He took a step forward and punched out. Tong Ming fist. A shrill sound erupted from Tianyang's fist. In the next moment, this fist directly broke through Bai Xiang's heavy defense and directly landed on his chest. Pooh! Bai Xiang spat out a mouthful of blood. His face instantly turned red, but his expression changed from disdain to seriousness. 4th level of the body refinement realm? Boom! It was as if a bomb exploded on the surface of the water, causing a huge uproar in the hearts of the surrounding people. Everyone was dumbfounded. 4th level of the body refinement realm? Tianyang, one of the 3 trash of the outer court, actually reached the 4th level of the body refinement realm? Among them, the strongest was only at the 4th level of the body refinement realm. Tianyang, from trash who could not even awaken his martial spirit, directly jumped to the 4th level of the body refinement realm? How was this trash? This was simply a monstrous genius. However, even if you're lucky enough to break through to the 4th level of the body refinement realm, it's still impossible for you to defeat me. Bai Xiang coldly snorted, and true yuan condensed on both his fists. Then, he roared, I'm also at the 4th level of the body refinement realm. Wave-breaking fist. Both fists struck out at the same time. Seeing this, the crowd could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Wave-breaking fist. This was one of the fist techniques in the martial skills pavilion. Compared to the previous wave-breaking fist, it was many times stronger. As for Tianyang, although he had already reached the 4th level of the body refinement realm, he definitely did not know any martial arts. With martial arts against without martial arts, it was simply a one-sided battle. Some of the more cowardly people had already closed their eyes, afraid to see the bloody scene that was about to unfold. From their point of view, Tianyang had not even used any martial arts. How could he possibly block Bai Xiang's wave-breaking fist? They were afraid that his head would explode like a watermelon, and blood would splatter everywhere. Wave-breaking fist? Wave-breaking fist? With this fist technique full of flaws, you're worthy of being called wave-breaking fist? Attacking with both fists, although the power is not bad, it is full of flaws. The strength is scattered, the momentum is empty, the true yuan is insufficient, and the chest is wide open. Facing the incoming fists, Tianyang slightly smiled, and without even using true yuan, he directly raised his leg and kicked out. Right on the chest. Pooh! Boom! Another mouthful of blood spurted out from Bai Xiang's mouth, and in the next moment, Bai Xiang's body flew out like a cannonball, heavily crashing into the wall of the training hall. As for Tianyang, he leisurely retracted his right leg, avoiding the fresh blood on the floor, and laughed. I'm afraid you're only breaking a small splash. Chapter 9. Silence filled the area. Looking at Bai Xiang, who was almost embedded into the wall, some of the disciples who had good mental fortitude widened their eyes. Some of the younger disciples opened their mouths so wide that they could stuff a duck egg inside. That was Bai Xiang. Bai Xiang, who was at the 4th level of the body refinement realm. Even if Tianyang had gotten rid of the title of trash and defeated Yang Dong, he should not have sent Bai Xiang flying with a kick. One must know that Bai Xiang and Yang Dong were not on the same level. One was the younger brother of the top 10 outer disciples and enjoyed superior cultivation resources. The other was one of the 3 famous trash, and could only bully the original Tianyang. And now, not only did Tianyang counterattack Yang Dong, he actually leapt up and sent Bai Xiang flying with a kick? Looking at Bai Xiang, who slowly slid down from the large pit, his neck crooked and his eyeballs rolled up, as if he had lost consciousness after being kicked by Tianyang, the shock in everyone's hearts came wave after wave. Tianyang's arrogant words still lingered in their ears. At the beginning, they only thought that it was arrogance, but now it seemed that it was not arrogance, but the embodiment of strength. After stepping into the martial way, Tianyang had truly soared. Nodding his head in satisfaction, Tianyang felt that this body was barely passable. At least it would not let his eyesight go to waste. One must know that if it was the original Tianyang, even if he had seen through Bai Xiang's weakness, he would not have kicked him so firmly and accurately. With one kick, a 4th level of the body refinement realm cultivator was sent flying, and he did not even use a bit of true yuan. The others did not react, but Tianyang knew that the 4th level of the body refinement realm brought by the Tong Ming fist far surpassed the 4th level of the body refinement realm of others. Before stepping into the clear Qi realm and opening the Qi Sea, the effects of cultivation techniques were not very obvious. Even in his previous life, Tianyang did not feel that the Divine Wilderness Heaven Spirit technique had any effect. Thus, only the Tong Ming fist could be used. Very good. Smiling, Tianyang turned around and walked towards the young disciple, who had turned pale and did not dare to look at him. Now, hand over the cultivation resources. Yes, yes. The young disciple's hands trembled as he picked up the box that Bai Xiang had yet to put away. If he still gave Tianyang 2 qi and blood pills, then he wouldn't be stupid. He would be courting death. In front of Tianyang's strength that sent Bai Xiang flying with a single kick, he, who was at the 2nd level of the body refinement realm, was as weak as a little chick. That was the cruel world of cultivation. In the celestial continent, strong cultivators were respected. Before, Tianyang was weak and small, and was looked down upon and bullied by others. He didn't even dare to fight back. But now Tianyang had defeated Bai Xiang. Naturally, this young disciple's disdain turned into fear. Tianyang took a box that was obviously bigger than the others. His hands were trembling so much that he almost dropped the box. Tianyang smiled and reached out to take it. He didn't have the intention to bicker with this small fry, who was only at the 2nd level of the body refinement realm. The lid of the box opened and the fragrance of the qi and blood pills wafted out. Tianyang sniffed carefully. He didn't care about the quality of the qi and blood pills from 10,000 years in the future. They were used to replenish qi and blood anyway. As for his previous life? In his previous life, the qi and blood pills he took when he was at the body refinement realm were all ruined pills refined by others. Although they contained qi and blood, most of them were extremely dangerous substances. If ordinary people took them, their bodies would probably explode. Tianyang, however, managed to endure it. That was how he became known as the Tianji Sword Emperor. If he could even take a ruined pill, how could Tianyang not be interested in this qi and blood pill? However, why are there 5 qi and blood pills and 1 spirit stone? That's not right. Hearing this, the crowd woke up from their shock and looked at Tianyang strangely. They were all given 5 qi and blood pills and 1 spirit stone. It was the standard allocation for ordinary outer sect disciples. Was there a problem? The young disciple who was in charge of providing cultivation resources didn't react at first. However, when he saw Bai Xiang lying limply on the ground, he suddenly realized and said, Yes, senior brother Tianyang should have given 10 qi and blood pills and 2 spirit stones. I was negligent. After that, the young disciple's hands and feet moved quickly. He was no longer trembling like before. Obviously, he also realized that Tianyang didn't intend to cause trouble for a small fry like him. These are senior brother's 10 qi and blood pills and 2 spirit stones. I was negligent. Please don't blame me, senior brother, the young disciple said. Hearing this, Tianyang couldn't help but take another look at this person. He was obviously older than him, but he actually called him senior brother? Shaking his head, Tianyang took the 10 qi and blood pills and 2 spirit stones. For him now, although all the qi and blood that he needed to cultivate Tongming Fist had been used up perfectly, it still consumed a large amount of qi and blood. With the qi and blood pills to replenish his qi, this urgent need was solved. When the crowd saw the young disciple's appearance and looked at Tianyang, they were a little confused. Then, they looked at Bai Xiang, who was lying on the ground, and suddenly felt relieved. For the past 5 months, Bai Xiang had been hogging Tianyang's cultivation resources. Now, it was Tianyang's turn to give him a taste of his own medicine. Although this was the case, the others didn't have the slightest intention of upholding justice. Bai Xiang's tyrannical behavior was also disliked by the crowd. No one present was a saint, so naturally they wouldn't provoke a trash who was in the midst of making a comeback. After receiving the cultivation resources, and double at that, Tianyang smiled and walked out of the cultivation hall. As for the person who wanted to see Tianyang make a fool of himself, he had already disappeared without a trace when Tianyang sent Bai Xiang flying with a kick. Now that I have the cultivation resources, I can continue cultivating Tongming Fist. However, the problem of the divine desolate heaven spirit art and the complete version of the spiral meridians not being a complete set still needs to be solved. The divine desolate heaven spirit art was originally a complete set with Tianyang's incomplete spiral meridians in his previous life. In this life, it was changed to the complete version, so the early stages didn't match. If he didn't pay attention to it, he was afraid that in the future, the cultivation method and the meridians would clash. A backlash would cause him to go berserk and be completely finished. Smacking his lips, Tianyang glanced at the Tianyang hanging high in the air. He felt a little emotional. Back when he was in the refinement realm, he had spent so much effort for a qi and blood pill. But now, he could receive cultivation resources every month. In my previous life, I was able to break through to the extreme realm that was unprecedented in the Sky Continent. In this life, I must break through the shackles and head to the world above the Sky Continent. After that, Tianyang kept the 2 boxes and strode towards the Martial Skills Pavilion beside the cultivation hall. Chapter 10. The Martial Skill Pavilion was a place that outer court disciples and some inner court disciples frequented. Although the inner court also had a martial skill pavilion that belonged to the inner court, the items inside were all carefully selected. Wanting to pick up something that was left out was practically an impossible task. Moreover, unless it was a powerful genius disciple, there was a certain time limit when choosing a martial skill cultivation method from the inner court martial skill pavilion. However, if it was the outer court, there was no such restriction. A small portion of the outer court martial skill pavilion was collected by the Lingyun sect itself. The rest of the martial skill pavilion were obtained by the sect disciples when they went out to carry out missions. However, they were unable to use the martial skill pavilion and would hand it over to the sect in exchange for more desirable items. Whether it was 10,000 years ago or now, this kind of exchange was extremely common. However, not everyone had a fixed goal, so there were many who exchanged it for contribution points and kept it to exchange for other items in the future. Therefore, the number of martial skill cultivation methods in the outer court martial skill pavilion increased. It was to the extent that in the Lingyun sect's legends, there was a senior brother who had heaven-defying luck and obtained an extremely powerful fist technique from the outer court martial skill pavilion. From then on, his cultivation soared to the heavens, leaping from the 5th level of the body refinement stage to the 8th level of the body refinement stage. He was even able to surpass levels and fight against cultivators at the initial stage of the Qi illumination stage. It was precisely because of this that countless people came to the martial skill pavilion. Therefore, when Tianyang saw that the flow of people in the martial skill pavilion was not at all inferior to the cultivation main hall, he was a bit stupefied. This was also due to the fact that the cultivation main hall was divided. Right now, it just so happened that it was the end of the month and most of the sect disciples who went out to carry out missions had returned. It had to be said that Tianyang's choice of time was not very good. Whatever. Shrugging his shoulders, Tianyang ignored the surging crowd around him. Relying on the cultivation of the Tong Ming fist, his physical strength was comparable to the 6th level of the body refinement stage. He squeezed some people aside and walked in. Those who enter the martial skill pavilion, show your disciple identification. At the entrance of the martial skill pavilion, an incomparably old man sat at the side. He raised his eyelids and glanced at Tianyang. However, he did not seem to recognize that this was one of the famous outer court's 3 great waste. He only said one sentence indifferently. Hearing this, Tianyang identification, the outer court disciple identification, Tianyang disciple identification, and disciple identification. This disciple certificate needed to be made with the Lingyun sect's exclusive Lingyun True Yuan. In this world, only the Lingyun sect had this method of making disciple certificates, and they were not afraid of others forging them. Raising his head, Tianyang looked at the categories of sword techniques, palm techniques, fist techniques, and so on. Only the category of cultivation techniques was not included. Finding things was the most troublesome. However, Tianyang was the Tianji Sword Emperor, who was at the peak of the Heaven Ascension realm. Since he cultivated the divine desolate sky spirit art, and was the only person in the outer court who cultivated a cultivation technique, he would resonate with similar cultivation technique. If it were an ordinary person, this kind of resonance would not attract the slightest bit of attention. The reason was because it was too weak. However, for the Tianji Sword Emperor Tianyang, who was at the peak of the Heaven Ascension realm, even the weakest resonance would be clearly captured by him. There. Tianyang was the Tianji Sword Emperor. He might be lacking in palm techniques and fist techniques, but if he was lacking in sword techniques, then he would not be able to play. He was simply unworthy of the title of Tianji Sword Emperor. His footsteps were quick. In a split second, Tianyang arrived in front of a pile of ancient books. Raising his head, he saw a sign that had not been wiped for a long time. This made Tianyang give a wry smile. Miscellaneous. That's right. In a world without cultivation techniques were indeed miscellaneous. Speaking of which, to be able to find a cultivation technique in a world without cultivation techniques was already considered rare. This fluctuation seems to be a little familiar? As he got closer, Tianyang felt the resonance become even clearer. The spiral meridians that were bestowed with the divine desolate sky spirit art imprint in his body trembled slightly, as if they had encountered something good. In his mind, the soul strength at the peak of the heavenly ascension realm, which he would not use unless it was an emergency, was also trembling slightly like the spiral meridians. In addition to Tianyang's own sense of familiarity, he could immediately tell that this cultivation technique was absolutely extraordinary. Most of the items in the miscellaneous area were some odd job disciples. When they roughly identified the items, they simply couldn't identify any useful items. Even if there were many people who wanted to come to the outer sect martial skill pavilion to pick up scraps, there weren't many who would pay attention to the miscellaneous area. After all, the items here were really too miscellaneous. The cabinets were still placed neatly, but looking at the faint traces of dust on them, it could be seen that even if there were people cleaning, not many people would touch the items here. 14 Basic Sword Technique. F***CK. Every outer sect disciple of the Soaring Cloud sect has more than 14 basic sword technique. The ones I know are no less than 100. Is this stuff just for show? Tianyang occasionally glanced at a book with a better packaging. As a result, an incomparably strong feeling of being cheated instantly filled his chest. This kind of trash was sold by the caddy 10,000 years ago. As Tianyang moved forward, one item after another entered his eyes. The familiar fluctuations he felt were also becoming more and more intense. However, 18 little methods for sweeping the floor, how to clean the doors and windows in 3 seconds. Even the Sky Pole Sword Emperor, who had great self-restraint, couldn't help but want to curse out loud when he saw these things. What the hell was this? Did those outer sect disciples have nothing better to do? This kind of thing could not even be exchanged for a single contribution point. Contribution points could be used to exchange for sect items. The value of these items was average. However, it was obvious that these lousy books were absolutely not worth a single contribution point. Endure. After taking a deep breath and closing his eyes, the Tianji Sword Emperor really could not bear to watch. However, as he gradually approached the end, the familiar fluctuations also became more and more intense. Finally, when it reached the most intense point, Tianyang slowly stood still and opened his eyes. On the cabinet in front of him, there was nothing but a broken ancient book. On the book, there were 3 words written in an ancient language that only Tianyang, the Tianji Sword Emperor from 10,000 years ago, could recognize. Chapter 11. I didn't expect it to be the Shi Su technique. Looking at the ancient words on the ancient book in front of him, Tianyang sighed. There was a touch of nostalgia in his words. Even though he was called the Celestial Pole Sword Emperor and was the strongest cultivator of the Celestial Pole continent 10,000 years ago, that was in a different era. In the previous era, the strongest cultivator of the Celestial Pole continent was called Emperor Shi Su. His cultivation was about the same as his. However, his virtual true essence was too difficult to guard against. It was like mercury that could penetrate through any hole. It was sometimes solid and sometimes like flowing water. Such a difficult attacking style, coupled with his terrifying true essence cultivation, the two together made the Shi Su Origin Emperor invincible in Heaven Continent. He was called the Emperor by the people of the continent, an existence on the same level as the Emperor. However, later on, the status of the Emperor changed and became slightly inferior to the Emperor. Although he, the Sky Pole Sword Emperor, had roamed unhindered for a lifetime, he had never met this famous primordial Emperor Shi Su. He had only seen his footprints in some ruins. He probably wasn't as unlucky as him, encountering a civilization that was hard to come by in millions of years and flying to another world. I never met him in my previous life, but in this life I encountered the Shi Su technique. The Shi Su technique was the cultivation technique that the Shi Su Origin Emperor cultivated. It was extremely tyrannical. Because of the Shi Su Origin Emperor's virtual true essence, the Shi Su technique, even if it was created later on, inevitably had some of the Shi Su Origin Emperor's shadow. As for Tianyang, he did not need the tyrannical power of the beginning void technique. His divine desolate heavenly spirit art was not inferior to the beginning void technique in the slightest. What he wanted was the unpredictable and changeable characteristics of the beginning void technique. Using it to transform his divine desolate heavenly spirit technique, the two complemented each other. Perhaps it could even erupt with more dazzling light than in his previous life. This Shi Su technique is indeed extremely suitable for my situation. In that case, let's use the Emperor's cultivation technique of the Shi Su Origin Emperor for me. Tianyang chuckled and picked up the dust-covered book. Based on the thickness of the book, he guessed that it was only the front part, and it wasn't the original. However, Tianyang did not need too many Origin Void technique in the first place. His cultivation technique was still based on the divine desolate heavenly spirit art. No matter how many cultivation techniques he had as support, they were only support. There are quite a number of sword techniques in my head, and there are many that are suitable for me now. However, if I were to take out a bunch of profound rank and earth rank sword techniques, I'm afraid it would shock the world. With the Tian family's background, I'm afraid it's impossible for them to come up with any profound martial technique. Although this world doesn't use heaven, earth, black, and yellow to classify martial techniques, they are still able to distinguish the high and low level of martial technique. Tianyang said in a low voice as he stood in place and used his true essence to shake off the dust on the origin void technique. Since I've come to the martial skills pavilion, then let's see how many pearls are buried in this place that has been blown into sand by the outer and inner disciples. Tianyang smiled faintly, then walked out of the corner of the miscellaneous section and headed towards the most popular section of swordsmanship. The sword was the king of all weapons. Among the 18 types of weapons, only the saber could compete with it in terms of popularity. It just so happened that sword techniques and saber techniques were placed together. Therefore, this place was considered the most crowded place in the entire martial skills pavilion. However, most of the people who came here to choose martial techniques were not here to pick up scrap. Instead, they were here to choose sword technique. After all, there were so many people. Even if there were good things, they would have long been taken away by others. He calmly walked in the middle of the crowd. He only condensed a thin layer of true essence on the surface of his body. Relying on the power of the slight vibration, he shook away the passers-by without them noticing. Only Tianyang had this level of control over his true essence. Let's not even talk about whether he could condense a layer of true essence on the surface of his body in this crowded place. Even if he managed to condense it, he would probably either injure others or use up his true essence. In this martial skills pavilion, there were often people who wanted to learn from each other. If he missed out on a good martial technique because of this crowded place, then he would regret it to death. There are really many people in this sword technique section. Looking at the bustling outer and inner disciples in front of him, Tianyang shook his head. The true essence on the surface of his body vibrated slightly again, pushing away the people blocking his way. Then, he suppressed his spiritual strength to a certain limit and released it. After coming to this world for so long, he was naturally familiar with his body and the strength of his spiritual strength. If he used his full strength, he would definitely explode in an instant. However, if it was just an ordinary scan, there were almost no side effects. Moreover, this spiritual strength was much stronger than people of the same level, or even people of the illuminating chi stage, who were one level higher than him would have a hard time. The mountain beheading sword technique has more than enough strength and fierceness, but not enough softness. If I don't control it well, I'm afraid I'll break my own sword. It's at most a low-grade yellow-rank sword technique. The Scattered Stars sword technique has an impressive name and extraordinary power. Unfortunately, it's at most a high-grade yellow-rank sword technique. Even if I use it as a cover, I can't use such a low-grade technique. As the Tianji Sword Emperor, his requirements for sword techniques were naturally very strict. Even if he had sword techniques that were countless times more powerful than those in the martial skills pavilion, he only came here to use them as a cover and a shield. However, this did not lower his requirements for sword technique. As the Tianji Sword Emperor, even if he was only in the body refining realm, he had to be at least in the profound realm. Otherwise, his opponents in his previous life would laugh to death. What a pity, what a pity! After this scan, the highest rank technique is still the Scattered Stars sword technique. I don't know if it's because the martial skills pavilion is open to the public and there are too many sand grains, or if it's because the pearls have been picked away. He shook his head and sighed. It seemed that because of the Shi Su Gong, his requirements for the martial skills pavilion were a bit too high. After walking a few steps, his spiritual strength once again scanned a dozen sword technique. However, the highest rank technique was still only a high-grade yellow-rank sword technique called the Vanishing Wind sword technique, which was of the same level as the Scattered Stars sword technique. Whatever, I'll just dig in my head. Maybe I can even find the sword techniques that I cultivated when I was in the clear chi realm in my previous life. However, even if that's the case, It's still not from the Lingyun sect. It's a bit troublesome. Rubbing the space between his eyebrows, Tianyang was just about to turn and leave. At this moment, the crowd suddenly surged. Tianyang, who did not have time to take a step forward, was actually brought back by a few steps. At this moment, the few sword techniques at the back also fell into the range of his spiritual strength scan. This is, the not weak fluctuation immediately attracted Tianyang's attention. He turned around and looked to the left. A very simple cloud-white scroll appeared in front of him. Flowing Clouds Sword Technique. 4 simple but not ancient words appeared. In Tianyang's heart, he already had a preliminary appraisal. Chapter 12. This martial skills pavilion actually has a middle-class profound sword technique? Tianyang was slightly taken aback. He originally thought that the Scattered Stars sword technique and the Absolute Wind sword technique were already the top techniques in the Outer Sect martial skills pavilion. He did not expect that there would be a middle-class profound sword technique. Looking at the cloudy white scroll, although it was not very eye-catching, it was not as inconspicuous as the Scattered Stars sword technique. It was obvious that other people also knew about the existence of the Flowing Clouds sword technique. However, the extraordinariness of this sword technique could be seen at a glance. The cloudy white scroll seemed to have a layer of flowing clouds on it, and a sense of elegance flowed out from it. Even if there was nothing inside, Tianyang was sure that this Flowing Clouds sword technique was definitely a middle-class profound sword technique. The number of times this body had visited the martial skills pavilion was not considered high. After all, the previous Tianyang was unable to enter the martial way and could only stare helplessly at the martial skills pavilion. His memory fragments were also incomplete. Therefore, he did not know why no one had tried to use the Flowing Clouds sword technique. Previously, there were at least 49 people looking at this place, if not 50. However, they were just looking. This left Tianyang scratching his head in confusion. Not to mention that this world had experienced the terrifying Great Destruction of Civilization. Even if the Great Destruction of Civilization hadn't happened and the martial Tao was flourishing 10,000 years ago, a mystic mid-grade martial skill shouldn't have been neglected like this. However, since he had made the best choice, after a cursory glance, he realized that there was no other sword technique in this area that was comparable to the Drifting Cloud sword technique. Naturally, Tianyang did not want to stay any longer. He took the incomplete copy of the Beginning Void technique and the Drifting Cloud sword technique and left the sword technique area. He could now recall that there were even middle-class profound sword techniques that he could practice. Of course, if Tianyang wanted to choose, he would not choose them. However, the middle-class profound sword technique that the Soaring Clouds sect had made Tianyang quite surprised. Tianyang, you seem to be quite famous. The old man sitting at the entrance of the martial skill pavilion seemed to have recovered some of his spirit. He took a look at Tianyang's Outer Sect Disciple Certificate and said with some surprise, 4th level of the body refinement realm, 15 years old, you can't be considered a genius. Maybe there were some disciples who passed by and casually talked about you. What kind of martial skill do you want? The old man said and returned Tianyang's Outer Court Disciple Certificate to Tianyang. When Tianyang heard this, he also showed the 2 cultivation methods and martial skills that he had chosen to the old man. This was also one of the rules. If you didn't let the elder check, then no matter how strong you were, even if you reached the clear chi realm, you wouldn't be able to walk out of the martial skill pavilion. I can't understand the ancient characters. They're probably antiques from before the Great Destruction. I wonder what they can do with something that no one can understand. Youngsters these days are becoming more and more incomprehensible. Looking at the incomplete version of the beginning illusionary technique, the old man didn't understand the meaning behind it at all. Among the miscellaneous items there were quite a few things that came from 10,000 years ago. Even the Lingyun sect had the incomplete version of the beginning illusionary technique. This kind of thing was enough to cause a bloodbath in his previous life. It could only be said that they were all sitting on a mountain of treasures without knowing it. The next one is the flowing cloud sword technique? Ignoring the incomplete version of the beginning illusionary technique that he couldn't understand, the old man's gaze turned to the white cloud scroll in Tianyang's other hand. His pupils slightly contracted. Could it be that this young disciple didn't know the reputation of the flowing cloud sword technique? It was powerful, but the difficulty of learning it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Even the sword technique that only inner sect disciples could learn was much easier than this. That's right. Tianyang smiled and said, I wonder if this disciple can learn it? Of course. The outer sect's martial skills pavilion has no restrictions for outer and inner sect disciples. But after saying such a sentence, the old man almost directly told Tianyang to leave. He forcibly changed the topic and advised, Kid, I see that your talent is not bad. Although the flowing cloud sword technique is very powerful, it's best that you don't touch it. Inner sect disciples who are much more talented than you, and even personal disciples, have all tried to cultivate this drift cloud sword art. In the end, a genius disciple named Luo Fian had been practicing this drift cloud sword art for many years, but she still couldn't get a glimpse of it. There was another direct disciple whose talent was even more shocking than Luo Fian's. Back then, he also tried to learn the flowing cloud sword technique. After practicing for a year, he only managed to find the entrance. This was even with the help of his master, an origin transformation stage expert. Otherwise, he would have ended up like Luo Fian. However, when he had just found the entrance, some inner sect disciples had already learned other sword technique. Their strength had already surpassed that genius disciple. Fortunately, that genius disciple's talent was really strong. Otherwise, one wrong step would lead to many wrong steps, and he would never be able to make a comeback. Although your talent is not bad, this flowing cloud sword technique, as if he was afraid of discouraging the young disciple in front of him, the old man didn't finish speaking and stopped him. The flowing cloud sword technique had been placed in the outer sect's martial skills pavilion for a long time. Many disciples had also tried to learn this extremely powerful sword technique. However, without exception, all of them ended up in failure. The best direct disciple had only managed to find the entrance after practicing for a year. Such a terrifying difficulty caused some very foolish and naive outer sect disciples to be scared away by the old man guarding the door just when they wanted to go and practice it. All of these things had proven that the old man's way of doing things was correct. It couldn't be any more correct. However, the difficulty of cultivating it was only for ordinary disciples of the soaring cloud sect. To the sky pole sword emperor, a mere mystic rank sword technique? He had even practiced an earth-ranked intermediate sword art before. That level of difficulty was enough to make countless mystic-ranked intermediate sword arts, and even superior sword arts, and even pinnacle sword arts, unable to compete with it. What could a mere streamcloud sword art do? Even so, disciple still wants to give it a try. If I still can't succeed in 3 months, then disciple will definitely return this flowing cloud sword technique. He lightly smiled, revealing an extremely confident smile. Seeing this, the old man could only sigh and say, Since you've already made up your mind, then I'll tell you something. This flowing cloud sword technique has a special rule. Even if you're an inner sect disciple, you can only borrow it for half a year. If you can't succeed in learning it in half a year, then you have no fate with it. You must return it. Hearing this, Tianyang once again revealed a trace of a smile. Half a year? Half a month was enough. It was only a middle profound rank sword technique. Could it really overturn the heavens? Take it away. I hope you'll realize your mistake soon. Take care of yourself. Chapter 13. Reporting, Snowstorm State Tian Family. A hurried voice came from outside the door. Hearing this, a handsome young man with an impatient expression walked out of the room and said unhappily, Who is it? How dare you make a ruckus in my courtyard? Your servant doesn't dare. When the person who had shouted saw the young man's face, he was scared out of his wits. Even the words that he had prepared were trembling. Greetings, young Master Tianjin. Your servant has something important to report. Oh! Hearing this, the arrogant young man also raised his eyelids and said disdainfully, Speak. If it's valuable, I'll forgive you. Yes, sir. That person heaved a sigh of relief and reported truthfully. The good horse that had run for nearly thousands of miles for 3 days didn't care about its master's attitude at all. Instead, it lay on the ground like a dead dog. It didn't even touch the fodder that some clever servants brought to its mouth. It was obvious that the person had come in a hurry. As he spoke more and more, the person's voice became more and more fluent. However, the young man who was called young Master Tianjin's face darkened bit by bit. When the person had finished reporting, Tianjin's face was so gloomy that it looked like water was about to drip out. Bang! A palm-shaped crater appeared on the sturdy wooden door. Seeing this, that person trembled with fear. He was afraid that the terrifying power of the palm strike would directly hit his body. This kind of power was probably at the level of body refinement stage level 3. I didn't expect that the soft cartilage corrosion poison that I had personally collected for such a long time would be so lucky that my useless cousin brother was able to dodge it. Tianjin's face was extremely gloomy. The news that the person had reported was not about some big incident nearby. Instead, it was about one of the 3 useless people in the Lingyun sect, Tianyang, who was thousands of miles away. Being at the 3rd level of the body refinement realm, Tianjin naturally couldn't believe that this Tianyang would be able to withstand the cartilage life corroding poison that could poison an expert at the 9th level of the body refinement realm and kill him in 45 minutes. The person in front of him was a servant that he had personally trained. Even if he was asked to jump into a fire pit, he would do it without hesitation. If he said that he saw Tianyang take the bone-softening life-corroding poison, then he must have taken the bone-softening life-corroding poison. However, Tianyang might have gotten lucky and spat out the cartilage corrosion poison before it could take effect. However, so what if he has condensed a martial soul and entered the martial Tao? Although this cousin is said to be the son of the Tian family's patriarch, without a corresponding cultivation base, how can he inherit the position of the Tian family's patriarch? Tianjin laughed coldly. If that's the case, there's no need for you to go back. You're just a piece of trash who has awakened a low-grade Huang-ranked martial spirit. Even if you had reached the 7th or 8th level of the body refinement realm before the clan gathering, you still wouldn't be able to stand a chance against me. Not to mention young Master Tianyu. Furthermore, could that piece of trash have reached the 7th or 8th level of the body refinement realm? Ha ha! Tianyang naturally didn't know what had happened in the Tian family of the Snowgale state. However, even if he knew, he probably wouldn't have taken Tianjin seriously. To the Tianji Sword Emperor, even if it was the Tian family, or even the entire Snowgale state, in his previous life, he could destroy them with a casual sentence, let alone a mere disciple of a small family. This flowing cloud sword art is far from just a middle-grade profound rank martial art. It might even be a middle-grade profound rank martial art. With the weakness of this body, cultivating a middle-grade profound rank martial art is already the limit. Even if I have a lot of earth-rank sword arts in my mind, I won't be able to cultivate them in a short period of time. After his rebirth, although he still retained the memories and soul of his previous life, the degree of familiarity with the sword, compared to the instincts engraved in the body of his previous life, this body was 180 streets away. Therefore, Tianyang couldn't be like in a novel, where one glance at it, one glance at it, one glance at it, one glance at it, and 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 one would be invincible. If that was really the case, why would Tianyang bother going to the martial arts pavilion? Wouldn't it be better to just stay in his residence and watch? The most important thing right now is to increase my cultivation. Su technique has been modified by me, and it has become a strange thing that doesn't belong to a cultivation technique. This way, not only can I fix the loopholes of the divine desolate heavenly spiritual art, but I can also let my true Yuan have the characteristics of the primordial Emperor Su in the early stages. It's killing two birds with one stone. Tianyang chuckled. Perhaps even the primordial Emperor Su himself wouldn't have thought that his cultivation technique would be modified into such a state by a descendant of a king. Primordial True Yuan was one of the trump cards of the primordial Emperor Su. That pervasive and deceitful characteristic was too difficult to deal with. Although it was only a little characteristic, it was enough to allow Tianyang's strength to increase greatly when he was in the body refinement realm and the clear qi realm. Then now I'll practice Tong Ming Fist properly. What's essential is the qi and blood pill. With a flip of his wrist, 2 boxes appeared in Tianyang's hands. With a slight movement of his fingers, Tianyang directly took out a qi and blood pill without wasting any energy. Qi and blood pill was refined from the qi and blood of demonic beasts. It was a first-grade pill, and also one of the most common first-grade pills. Pills were divided into 6 grades. Although it was a first-grade pill, it was still quite rare for a body refinement realm cultivator. It was light red all over. Sniffing carefully, there was a trace of bloody smell lingering at the tip of the nose. Speaking of this bloody smell, Tianyang frowned slightly. This qi and blood pill seems to be a little unfamiliar with refining the qi and blood of demonic beasts. Just the bloody smell released outside has lost a lot of medicinal efficacy. In addition, if taken before refining, the impurities contained in it are likely to hinder one's cultivation. In his previous life, Tianyang naturally didn't care about these things. However, it wasn't easy for him to be reborn. How could Tianyang continue his incomparably difficult life? The qi and blood pill in his hand was also slowly put down. In his previous life, Tianyang was far from just the Tianji Sword Emperor. In his previous life, he also had the strength of a 6th-grade alchemist. He was the Tianji Sword Emperor who integrated alchemy and martial arts. Upgrading and modifying a qi and blood pill was naturally a piece of cake. In his rebirth as a Sword Emperor in this life, he must eat the best pills, use the best sword, and kill the strongest enemies. Then, Tianyang smiled slightly. A strange light flashed in his eyes. In the next moment, flames condensed from his inner yuan slowly rose and enveloped the qi and blood pill within. Chapter 14. Alchemy was a special skill used to assist one's cultivation in the Sky Continent. Those who were proficient in the art of alchemy were called alchemists. Alchemists could refine all kinds of strange pills that could give cultivators great strength, or extremely fast cultivation speed, or a sudden burst of true yuan, and so on. There were all kinds of strange effects. It was also because alchemists could bring such a powerful auxiliary effect to cultivators that alchemists who were proficient in the art of alchemy were also highly respected. They were roughly divided into grades 1 to 6 based on what kind of pills they could refine. Grade 1 was the worst, and grade 6 was the highest. In the world above the heaven ascension state, there would probably be even more powerful alchemists. As for Tianyang, as the Tianji Sword Emperor in his previous life, he was also a supreme alchemist of the 6th level. He didn't even need to use 1/10,000th of his soul power to refine a mere qi and blood pill. Generally, alchemy, even if it was to refine a simple pill or extract medicinal herbs, required the help of a cauldron. However, as a 6th-level alchemist and a peak heaven ascension state emperor, Tianyang naturally didn't need any external help to refine a mere qi and blood pill. The raging flame burned and enveloped the qi and blood pill. In the next moment, Tianyang immediately felt everything contained within the qi and blood pill. The essence blood of the wind claw tiger, the essence blood of the earth python, plus various low-grade medicinal herbs, such as green Ganoderma. The medicinal herbs are alright and can be considered average. However, the refining method is a little complicated and crude. Crude wasn't a problem. After all, refining so many qi and blood pills was unavoidable. However, the complicated and ineffective steps were the problem of the alchemist. When refining the essence blood of the earth python, I used the method of using a large fire to attack fiercely and a small fire to refine slowly. However, although this method is troublesome, it can't completely expel the yin qi within. Fortunately, those who take the qi and blood pill are all cultivators in the body refinement state. Otherwise, they would have suffered sooner or later. Tianyang sighed softly as he understood everything about the qi and blood pill. Then, the flame that wasn't considered fierce suddenly rose up. He also had a grasp on how to upgrade the qi and blood pill. Time passed quickly. In the flame, the qi and blood pill constantly emitted impurities that were burned into gas by the high temperature. The qi and blood pill that emitted a faint bloody smell became completely plain and unadorned. Tianyang, along with the others at the right time. These qi and blood pills were refined by the same person. Since that was the case, he naturally didn't need to add or reduce the steps and directly refine them all. Blood qi and blood. 15 minutes. In S's of. After 15 minutes, his body could no longer hold on. Even though it was considered pretty good for an average 4th level body refinement realm cultivator, since Tianyang had been reborn, he naturally wanted to perfect every step of the way. However, before the true yuan in Tianyang's body was completely exhausted, the 10 blood energy pills had finally turned into the most perfect blood energy pill. Seeing this, Tianyang did not hesitate and directly took out one pill and swallowed it. If one were to cultivate after consuming a large amount of energy, then the effect of cultivation would be better than usual. Although these improvements weren't obvious, Tianyang knew very well that cultivation was like rowing a boat against the current. Although these improvements weren't obvious, they were necessary. If he couldn't even do the basics properly, then he wouldn't have been able to become the number 1 Tianji Sword Emperor in the continent. When the blood energy pill entered his stomach, it immediately turned into a surge of qi and blood. Tianyang's originally overdrawn strength was immediately replenished by this surge of qi and blood. At this time, after replenishing Tianyang's qi and blood, the perfect blood energy pill still didn't consume much of its medicinal power, as expected of a pill that I spent a lot of effort to upgrade. Then, Tong Ming Fist. Tianyang shouted softly. Suddenly, there was an explosion in the air. The air in front of him seemed to have been blasted by this sudden violent punch, creating a small crater in the ground. Seeing this, Tianyang muttered to himself for a moment. He didn't continue to destroy his residence. Instead, he leaped up and arrived in front of the scarecrow. Tong Ming Fist was just a type of body-tempering fist technique. It was just a way to use one's strength. A straight punch was Tong Ming Fist, an uppercut was Tong Ming Fist, a curved punch was Tong Ming Fist, and even Lu Shan's rising Dragon Lord was Tong Ming Fist. Tianyang smiled faintly at the specially reinforced scarecrow in front of him. The true yuan in his body surged out along with the surging qi and blood. Then, he attacked continuously. Pung, pung, pung. With just 3 punches, the scarecrow that was able to withstand the full force attack of a body refinement realm level 7 was declared useless. Seeing this, Tianyang wasn't surprised. He summoned a new scarecrow from the side and continued to temper his body. Following the continuous bombardment of Tong Ming Fist, the various organs and even the skin in his body trembled slightly. Some impurities were removed and a feeling of hunger appeared. At this moment, the surging qi and blood from the qi and blood pill directly replenished Tianyang's body and strengthened it once again. Tong Ming Fist was a body-tempering fist technique that Tianyang had purposely upgraded in his previous life. The tyrannical effect it brought was naturally not comparable to other people's random body-tempering technique. The current Tianyang was completely comparable to a body refinement realm level 6. Ha! He felt that the surging qi and blood in his body, following the continuous improvement of his body's quality, were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. All the muscles and cells in his body seemed to have eaten their fill. No matter how he punched, there was no way to make them hungry again. Very obviously, the current Tianyang had already reached the critical point of body refinement realm level 4. He was only a slight push away from body refinement realm level 5. Taking a deep breath, Tianyang's eyes flickered. An unparalleled emperor's domineering aura erupted. The scarecrow in front of him was actually blown away by this formless aura and swayed in all directions. This scarecrow wasn't the same as before. It was a tough scarecrow that Tianyang had applied for and could withstand the full force attack of a qi illuminating realm cultivator. In the next moment, the true yuan in Tianyang's body also began to slowly circulate. The virtual yuan true yuan was completely refined by Tianyang and became a tyrannical true yuan that belonged exclusively to him. Within the spiral meridians, the true yuan that had been refined by Tianyang until it was incomparably pure flowed slowly. The aura around Tianyang's body also rose to the limit of body refinement realm level 4. In the next moment, he punched out. Bang! The scarecrow in front of him, that could withstand the full force attack of a qi illuminating realm cultivator, was instantly punched through by Tianyang. It seemed to be similar to before. However, seeing this, Tianyang didn't even frown at all. The corners of Tianyang's mouth curled up slightly as he laughed softly. Tong Ming Fist, Yi Ming Bang. Yi Ming Force. In the next moment, the scarecrow in front of him turned into bits of grass that filled the air. In Tianyang's body, the qi and blood pill's medicinal effects that hadn't been completely absorbed all this time also became nutrients for countless cells in his body and were directly devoured. Feeling that his body had suddenly become much stronger, Tianyang smiled slightly. The Tong Ming Fist and the perfect qi and blood pill complemented each other and were even more powerful than he had imagined. At this moment, the blood qi that Tianyang's body was emitting was shockingly. Chapter 15. Soaring Cloud Sect, Outer Sect. Beside a small mountain, a courtyard that was different from the other Outer Sect disciples' residences lay peacefully beside a small stream. The name on the door represented the owner of this small courtyard. It was Bai Xiang's brother, Bai Lu, who was one of the top 10 Outer Sect disciples and one of the top 5 disciples. Big brother! Big brother! In the courtyard, Bai Xiang, who had just woken up, ran to the young man with snot and tears. "You have to stand up for me. What's the matter? Why are you so flustered?" Bai Lu furrowed his brows. Wasn't Bai Xiang supposed to go to the cultivation hall to collect cultivation resources today? According to his character, he shouldn't have returned empty-handed with cultivation resources that were several times more than the ordinary disciples. Also, where are my cultivation resources? Ignoring the obvious shoe prints on Bai Xiang's body, Bai Lu's face suddenly turned cold. He raised his right hand and condensed true origin. "Speak quickly. If you don't speak, then you'll be punished." No one would have thought that Bai Xiang had forcefully taken so many cultivation resources not because of Bai Lu's power, but because of Bai Lu's request. Bai Lu's talent wasn't very high. It was already not bad for him to be able to enter the top 20 Outer Sect disciples. The reason why he was able to enter the top 10 was mostly because of his own schemes. First, he used his own strength to make a name for himself in the Soaring Cloud Sect's Outer Sect. Then, he used his younger brother to intimidate others, to seize cultivation resources, which he would then give to himself. Under such a cycle, Bai Lu's strength naturally rose. Every time he thought of this, Bai Lu couldn't help but feel proud. The top 3 people were all extremely talented, but their brains weren't as flexible as his. They only knew how to seize cultivation resources. How could they become strong? Therefore, under this cycle, Bai Lu also jumped from the top 20 to the top 10. Now, Bai Xiang, who went to seize cultivation resources, actually returned empty-handed. This naturally made Bai Lu extremely angry. Big brother! Seeing the true origin that was gradually condensing, Bai Xiang's face instantly changed. He hurriedly said, "It's not that I'm useless. Someone stole the cultivation resources that were supposed to be given to you." Hearing this, the true origin that was condensing in Bai Lu's hand relaxed a little. However, his face became gloomy. "Who is it? Could it be Lu Wuming or Zhang Daoran? The two of them have always disliked me. I'm afraid they're here to disgust me." "No, it's not." Hearing the names of the two outer court disciples, Bai Xiang hurriedly said, "If Bai Lu went to find trouble with them, and the result was that it was not them who did it, it would be difficult for him to escape death." Bai Xiang had a deep understanding of Bai Lu's cruelty. Moreover, Lu Wuming and Zhang Daoran weren't easy to deal with. If Bai Lu was killed instead, how could he be arrogant and despotic in the future? It wasn't them? Bai Lu was slightly stunned when he heard this, and then he said coldly, "Then who was it? Other than the two of them, who else knows about my methods?" "Yes, it's Tianyang. One of the three trash of the outer court, that Tianyang who can't condense a martial spirit," Bai Xiang said loudly. Deep hatred burned in his eyes. This Tianyang had not only stolen his cultivation resources, but he had also stolen Bai Xiang's share. Moreover, he had made a fool of himself in front of so many people in the cultivation main hall. From Bai Xiang's point of view, the cultivation resources that he had taken from Tianyang 5 months ago were already his personal belongings. Yet Tianyang had dared to take them back. This was simply disgraceful. He understood that he couldn't deal with Tianyang himself, but Bai Lu could. From his point of view, Bai Lu, who had already reached the 7th level of the body refinement realm, was definitely not someone that a trash like Tianyang could contend against. Tianyang? Hearing this familiar name, Bai Lu's expression froze slightly. Then, he suddenly became furious. A piece of trash actually dared to ruin my plans. And you? Even if he had some good fortune, you shouldn't have been defeated. You're even more trash than Tianyang. His most important plan had actually been ruined by a piece of trash. Naturally, Bai Lu was incomparably furious. Moreover, this piece of trash had actually defeated his younger brother. This Tianyang, last month, he was still so scared by me that he only dared to look at me from afar in the cultivation main hall. But this month, he suddenly rose up. "Big brother, I think that this Tianyang must have obtained some kind of treasure. That's why he was able to break the shackles of his innately crippled meridians." Bai Xiang saw that he had successfully angered Bai Lu and immediately urged him to stand up. He had long hated Tianyang to the bone. If Bai Lu really became furious, Tianyang would definitely not be able to escape death. So what if his background was one of the 8 great families of Blizzard State? The Tian family had probably already lost their patience with this piece of trash. Didn't he see that the little servant who had been by his side recently had left without him noticing? Treasure? Hearing these 2 words, Bai Lu suddenly couldn't help but stand up from his chair. That's right. This Tianyang was originally a piece of trash. How could he suddenly soar up? To be able to defeat you, he's at least at the 4th level of the body refinement realm. Then, tomorrow, bring the one who has been bullying him, Hua Hao, who is also one of the 3 great pieces of trash in the outer court, and ask him to come here. If he doesn't comply, then use the thing I gave you to chop off his limbs and bring him here. The corner of Bai Lu's mouth curled up into a cruel smile. In his heart, he was also thinking about the treasure that was about to be in his hands. A treasure that could allow a piece of trash to break through to the 4th level of the body refinement realm. falling into the hands of a piece of trash, was simply like a pearl covered in dust. Only by giving him Bai Lu could this treasure emit its true brilliance. With this treasure, Bai Lu's originally mediocre talent would definitely be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with those in the top 10. In this case, in the outer court, who would be his opponent? It's only a fine line away from a true high-grade profound martial technique. What a pity! After opening the flowing cloud sword technique that he obtained from the martial technique pavilion, Tianyang shook his head. His gaze looked at the white clouds that seemed to be flowing in the scroll, and he felt that it was a pity. However, this method of imparting martial techniques is also unconventional. It actually requires the cultivator to comprehend it himself, and not directly teach it. Ordinary martial technique scrolls would directly use words to explain it. How could they be like this flowing cloud sword technique, where there was an obscure diagram of flowing clouds that allowed the cultivator to comprehend the sword technique from it? The reason why those geniuses were unable to successfully cultivate it is also because of this. Chapter 16. The next day, early in the morning, Tianyang slowly awoke from his cultivation state. Looking at the cloud-white scroll beside his hand, he couldn't help but smile. This drifting cloud sword technique was rather peculiar. If an ordinary person were to comprehend a trace of its true meaning, this drifting cloud diagram would directly project the drifting cloud sword technique into that person's mind when that person was cultivating. However, that was only for ordinary people. For Tianyang, although his soul power from his previous life had been depleted by 99% after his rebirth, that indestructible soul sea defense was definitely not something that the flowing cloud sword technique could penetrate. Tianyang himself didn't need that thing to assist him. This was because, within 2 hours after he saw through the mysteries of the flowing cloud sword technique, he had already cultivated the flowing cloud sword technique to the large success stage. If others were to see such a terrifying speed of martial arts cultivation, their jaws would probably drop. This speed was simply too shocking. If I wanted to, give me another 4 hours and I should be able to cultivate it to the great perfection stage. After scrutinizing the cloud-white scroll, Tianyang chuckled and kept it. However, since I have already comprehended all the mysteries within, even if I don't deliberately cultivate it, I can automatically reach the great perfection stage. Why should I waste this time? After that, Tianyang slowly stood up. His heart was filled with anticipation. After reaching the 5th level of the body refinement realm, he could finally cultivate the powerful martial technique that he had risked his life to obtain in his previous life. The endless memories of his previous life slowly flipped through in his mind. Just before the powerful martial technique appeared, Tianyang suddenly raised his eyebrows. His soul power moved slightly, interrupting his actions of flipping through the memories. He grinned. "Hey, a guest is here." At this moment, an explosive shout came from outside. Listening to the voice, it was somewhat familiar. "Tianyang, Lord Bai Lu wants to see you. Why aren't you obediently coming out and leaving with me?" Hua Hao's incomparably arrogant voice came from outside. His heart was filled with pride. Previously, when Yang Dong was taken care of by Tianyang, he was afraid that Tianyang would settle the score with him in the next moment. And now, Tianyang hadn't even settled the score with him yet, but someone like Bai Lu had already taken a fancy to him. He wanted her to do something for him. This was exactly what he wanted to do. With Bai Lu as his backer, Hua Hao was naturally very pleased. He immediately rushed to the door of Tianyang's residence. I didn't expect you to wake up, but..." Hua Hao's gaze happened to meet Tianyang's. He was slightly startled and unconsciously took a step back. In the next moment, he thought of Bai Lu's brother, who was standing behind him, and his confidence was instantly boosted. "Even after hearing Lord Bai Lu's orders, you still dare to feign ignorance? Let me ask you, what punishment do you deserve?" Hua Hao's words came out like a cannonball in 3 seconds. Tianyang couldn't help but snicker when he heard this. Within the Lingyun sect, disciples of the same generation only address each other as senior brother and junior brother. I don't know what you're thinking when you immediately called Lord Bai Lu. Oh, isn't the one behind Bai Xiang, who was sent flying by my kick yesterday? So that's how it is. After Bai Xiang found you, you couldn't wait to recognize him as your master. This servile nature really makes me feel ashamed of my inferiority. Tianyang lightly laughed. Hua Hao was stunned when he heard this, but he quickly reacted. His face instantly turned red and purple, and the true yuan of the body refinement realm level 1 instantly exploded out. Tianyang, you're courting death. TCH. Tianyang was only at the body refinement realm level 1, so he didn't even bother to use his true yuan. He directly extended his leg and kicked. Hua Hao's incomparably weak true yuan was directly scattered by this kick. What? Hua Hao's pupils shrank as he looked at Tianyang in front of him. His anger seemed to have been splashed by a bucket of cold water, and half of it dissipated. However, he hardened his heart and summoned his martial soul. Martial soul, grass snake. Snake devouring fist. Tianyang, prepare to die. An illusion of a grass snake suddenly appeared in Hua Hao's hand. Seeing this, Bai Xiang's pupils shrank slightly. He actually summoned his martial soul so quickly. Was Tianyang's strength that terrifying? You dare to use such insignificant skills to make a fool of yourself? Tianyang coldly laughed. Without any fancy moves, he directly threw out a punch and instantly bombarded Hua Hao's fist. The green grass snake was directly turned into gas by this violent punch, and Hua Hao's body was directly sent flying by Tianyang's punch. Bai Xiang didn't even have the time to help before Hua Hao's body was sent flying into the grass a few hundred meters away. It was unknown whether he was dead or alive. Body Refinement Realm. Level 5. Bai Xiang's pupils shrank to the extreme as he stared at Tianyang, who was leisurely withdrawing his fist. Yesterday, he was only at the Body Refinement Realm Level 4. How did he reach the terrifying level of Body Refinement Realm Level 5 now? This kind of monstrous leveling speed, even his big brother Bai Lu couldn't compare. A trace of fear emerged in his heart. Bai Xiang couldn't help but take a few steps back. Seeing this, Tianyang chuckled and took a few steps forward. Tianyang walked, Bai Xiang retreated. Tianyang walked again, Bai Xiang retreated again. This cycle repeated several times until Bai Xiang crashed into a large tree, unable to retreat any further. Tianyang, you're courting death. Feeling the hard object on his back and the pain at the back of his head, Bai Xiang suddenly woke up. The fear in his heart was directly covered up by the item bestowed by Bai Lu. You actually dared to injure my big brother Bai Lu's people. Break your own arms now, crawl over and beg for mercy, and I'll spare your life. Otherwise, eat this move of mine. Wild Tiger Fist. Bai Xiang roared. Unknowingly, a pair of gloves exuding a fierce aura had appeared in his hands. Seeing this, Tianyang chuckled. I originally thought you had something to rely on. I didn't expect you to rely on a broken low-grade artifact. Wild Tiger Fist? It only has the name of Wild Tiger, but it doesn't have the strength of a Wild Tiger. This kind of Wild Tiger Fist might as well change its name to Kitten Fist. With a sneer, Tianyang directly circulated his true origin and punched out. Tong Ming Fist. Bang. Tong Ming Fist. A sound with a hidden force. On the surface, the tyrannical fist force, coupled with the fierce hidden force, directly smashed Bai Xiang's gloves into pieces. Spitting out a mouthful of blood, Bai Xiang was directly smashed into the large tree by the incomparably tyrannical force. He stared at the powder of the gloves in his hands, his eyes filled with fear as he looked at Tianyang. That was a low-grade artifact. Even if it was a broken low-grade artifact, it was enough to greatly increase the power of his Wild Tiger Fist. The material itself was also extremely hard. For the refinement realm, it was almost indestructible. And now it was actually smashed into powder by Tianyang's fist. A shadow suddenly enveloped Bai Xiang. Tianyang's incomparably brilliant smile was also reflected in Bai Xiang's line of sight. Tell Bai Lu if he wants to call me over, he's not qualified. Chapter 17. At this moment, Bai Xiang was looking at Tianyang with an expression of incomparable fear. Trembling. That was a low-grade artifact. Even if it was only an incomplete low-grade artifact, it was still a low-grade artifact. Low-grade artifacts were all incomparably tough existences. Every low-grade artifact could greatly increase the combat power of a body refinement realm cultivator. For example, Bai Xiang was originally sent flying by Tianyang's kick. Now that he had a low-grade artifact, he became cocky. However, he was still sent flying by Tianyang's kick. However, low-grade artifacts were incomparably precious. Every one of them was worth at least tens of thousands of gold coins. Even if they were incomplete, they still had a tenacity and a tenth of the value of the complete version. However, such a pair of gloves had been shattered by Tianyang with a single punch. God, even if Bai Lu personally attacked, he might not be able to destroy this incomplete low-grade artifact. However, Tianyang did it. If Heavenly Sun knew what he was thinking, he would probably laugh in disdain. Even if it was a complete artifact, as long as Heavenly Sun could find the energy node within, he could easily destroy it, let alone an incomplete artifact. The energy core of every artifact, which was the energy node, was often the weakest point. Generally speaking, it was very difficult to find. However, was it that difficult for the Tianji Sword Emperor? Pooh! A mouthful of blood was spat out from Bai Xiang's mouth. His face immediately turned pale. Tianyang was still closing in on him. The hatred in his heart was still there, but at this moment, fear had taken over. Don't come over. The tree behind him had already been shattered by the terrifying punch. At this moment, Bai Xiang had fallen to the ground. He looked at Tianyang with incomparable horror and said in a trembling voice, My big brother is Bai Lu. If you come over, my big brother will definitely not forgive you. A trace of blood flowed down from the corner of Bai Xiang's mouth. His legs could not stop trembling. In Bai Xiang's heart, that monstrous hatred once again took the upper hand. Damn it! Bastard Tianyang, damn it! You actually dared to force me into such a situation, and even destroyed a damaged low-grade artifact that Big Brother Bai Lu bestowed upon me. Tianyang is dead for sure. At this moment, Bai Xiang was roaring madly in his heart. When Tianyang heard this, he chuckled softly. How could he not know what Bai Xiang was thinking? Just by looking at the subtle changes in his eyes, one could tell most of it. However, seeing it was one thing, and whether or not he cared was another. In the eyes of the Tianji Sword Emperor, Bai Xiang's actions were nothing more than a clown's. Get lost, Bai Lu? What the hell? If he really wants to see me, then he should come and invite me himself. After saying this, Tianyang casually tossed the unconscious Hua Hao to Bai Xiang's side and returned to his own residence. When he saw this, Bai Xiang was filled with incomparable hatred. However, his trembling legs told him that if he continued to provoke Tianyang, then there was only one thing that awaited him: death. The Tianji Sword Emperor had never been a good-tempered person. To him, a clown like Bai Xiang was fine if he appeared once or twice. He would treat it as entertainment. However, if he continued to provoke him, the fine steel sword in his hand would tell them why the flowers were so red. Bastard Tianyang! A piece of trash like you actually dared to be so arrogant. You even dared to destroy Big Brother's artifact. Just you wait, when Big Brother makes his move, trash like you will only be able to run wild at this time. Bai Xiang stood up shakily and glared at the door that had been closed again. However, he did not dare to take a single step closer. Useless trash. I was wondering why you were able to bully Tianyang. In the end, you were defeated by Tianyang in one move. A piece of trash like you should just die. Bai Xiang shot a disgusted look at Hua Hao, who had been thrown to his side by Tianyang. Without any hesitation, He left Tianyang's residence without looking back, as if some dreadful beast was hiding there. What? Bai Xiang ran back with a bloody nose and a swollen face. Not only had he lost Huahao, but he had even destroyed his gloves. Even though Bai Lu had good self-restraint, he could not help but explode in rage. Tianyang, this trash, not only did he disobey my orders, he even dared to injure you? And he even wants me to go there personally? This Tianyang, does he really think that he can be so arrogant just because he has a little bit of strength? The veins on his forehead bulged. When had Bai Lu, who had always lived like a prince, ever suffered such humiliation? Although Tianyang had only taught Bai Xiang a lesson from the beginning to the end, he did not mention him at all. However, the lackey that he had sent out was actually beaten to such a state by Tianyang. It was like a ruthless slap to Bai Lu's face. When had Bai Lu ever suffered such humiliation? As one of the top 10 outer disciples, Bai Lu was respected by the other disciples no matter where he went. However, Tianyang, one of the top 3 trash, actually dared to injure Bai Xiang. That's right, big brother. This Tianyang really has no respect for his elders. He doesn't know how to respect his teachers and teachings. This is unacceptable. If he dares to disobey senior brother now, he will be even worse in the future. If we don't get rid of him now, I'm afraid he will think that big brother is easy to bully in the future and become even worse. At this moment, Bai Xiang was kneeling in front of Bai Lu as he spoke with snot and tears. The more he spoke, the more gloomy Bai Lu's face became. Then, he slapped the armrest and stood up abruptly. Bang! The armrest instantly turned into sawdust. In the next moment, Bai Lu's figure directly arrived at the door of the house in the small courtyard. I'd like to see what ability this Tianyang has to be so arrogant. Bai Lu's murderous words slowly echoed in the small courtyard. 9 refined dragon body. I never expected that the body-refining cultivation technique that I obtained in my previous life was a cultivation technique for cultivating the dragon body. Flipping through the incomparably profound cultivation technique in the depths of his memory, Tianyang couldn't help but click his tongue in admiration even though he was experienced and knowledgeable in his previous life and had dominated the continent. This cultivation technique was obtained when he had just entered the heavenly completion realm and hadn't yet become the strongest person in the continent. He had risked his life to fight for this cultivation technique with others in the historical remains. And this life and death battle had allowed Tianyang to comprehend a lot. He had comprehended many sword techniques, which directly suppressed this cultivation technique. It was to the extent that he had forgotten about it and only picked it up after his rebirth. 9 refined dragon body, a low-grade heaven-class cultivation technique. It looked like a low-grade cultivation technique, but its power was actually comparable to a middle-grade cultivation technique. If it was cultivated to the point of perfection, it could even reach the terrifying level of a high-grade heaven-class cultivation technique. This was because this cultivation method was to allow the naturally weak human body to cultivate into the incomparably terrifying innate dragon body of the dragon clan. As the name suggests, the 9 refined dragon body should have gone through 9 cultivation sessions. This first session is. Just as Tianyang was about to start flipping through the cultivation technique, a loud shout directly interrupted Tianyang's thoughts. Tianyang, get out here! The sound waves were like rolling thunder, even causing some of the surrounding papers to fly up. Such a large commotion in the surroundings, as well as the deliberately created rolling echoes, directly interrupted Tianyang's thoughts. And Tianyang's expression immediately became gloomy. Daring to interrupt the Tianji Sword Emperor's cultivation? Chapter 18. What's going on? This voice seems to belong to the 7th level of the body refinement realm, Bai Lu, one of the top 10 outer court disciples? I've seen him once. This voice is undoubtedly Bai Lu. The person he's shouting seems to be one of the 3 great trash, Tianyang? He's already so arrogant after defeating Yang Dong. Yesterday, He even beat up Bai Xiang in the cultivation main hall. Now, he's provoked Bai Lu to make a move. Tianyang's good days are coming to an end. After Bai Lu's voice rang out, a few mocking and exclamations of surprise were softly heard by Bai Lu's sensitive hearing. Hearing these mocking words of praise for Tianyang, Bai Lu was extremely pleased. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up into a smile. Looking at the wooden door that had been crudely put back in place, he coldly shouted, "Tianyang, I know you're inside. I, Bai Lu, have personally arrived. Why aren't you quickly coming out?" At this moment, before Bai Lu could say anything threatening, the somewhat tattered wooden door was violently kicked open. Tianyang's face was very gloomy as he looked at the two people in front of him. Standing behind him was a youth with a bloody nose and a swollen face. Without a doubt, it was Bai Xiang, who had been beaten into an idiot by him not long ago. Standing in front of him was a person with a face that was 50 to 60% similar to Bai Xiang and emitted traces of qi and blood. It was obvious that he was an expert at the 5th level of the body refinement realm or above. It was Bai Lu, one of the top 10 outer disciples, an overbearing existence that ordinary outer disciples feared. "Bai Lu, you're Tianyang?" Raising his chin and looking at Tianyang with slanted eyes, Bai Lu coldly laughed and said, "You don't look like much. You actually dare to disobey my orders with the appearance of a trash that can't step onto the martial Tao? I heard that you've condensed a martial soul not long ago? You've gotten rid of the title of trash that can't step onto the martial Tao? What a pity. Trash is trash. Now I, Bai Lu, have personally come to the door of your little broken house. Why aren't you obediently kneeling down?" As he spoke, a strong burst of qi and blood erupted from Bai Lu's body. Even though Bai Xiang was at the 4th level of the body refinement realm, he couldn't help but take a few steps back with a pale face. The faint red blood aura that seemed to have a physical form circled around Bai Lu's body. This was the true power of the body refinement realm. Once one reached the 5th level of the body refinement realm, they would be able to release blood aura. External release of qi and blood was a skill unique to the body refinement realm. It was also the standard to measure a body refinement realm cultivator's strength. Before the clear qi realm, the degree of external release of qi and blood could also indirectly indicate a person's combat strength. Bai Lu, on the other hand, could release his blood qi as far as 10 feet. In other words, his blood qi was at the level of 10 feet. Even among the Lingyun sect's outer sect disciples in the refinement realm, he could be considered one of the best. Even the most ordinary body refinement realm cultivator could roughly measure the length with a glance. As the Tianji Sword Emperor, Tianyang's soul power was so strong that he could directly see the length of qi and blood. 30 meters and 3 inches. 7th level of the body refinement realm. Is this what gives you the right to be arrogant? Tianyang's soft laughter slowly spread out. He was extremely disdainful of Bai Lu's qi and blood that could only reach 30 meters and 3 inches. Back then, he cultivated the trashy Tong Ming fist, unmodified version, and 8 inferior qi and blood pills. Even so, he was able to reach Bai Lu's current level when he was at the 6th level of the body refinement realm. When he was at the 9th level of the body refinement realm, his qi and blood reached 40 meters. Bai Lu ate superior qi and blood pills and cultivated a good body refinement realm martial technique. In the end, when he reached the 7th level of the body refinement realm, he was the same as when he was at the 6th level of the body refinement realm in his previous life. Was this fellow's cultivation a waste of time? 7th level of the body refinement realm and qi and blood that could reach 30 meters. In his previous life, this level of cultivator was almost at the level of a trashy street. They wouldn't even be enough to be the Tianji Sword Emperor's doorman. 7th level of the body refinement realm? It's enough to crush you. You're only at the 5th level of the body refinement realm. Even if you can release your qi and blood, what level can you reach? Bai Lu's face suddenly darkened as he glared at Tianyang. Although his 30 meters of qi and blood couldn't be considered as the best among the top 10, it was close to the middle. The person in first place only had a qi and blood of 180 meters when he was at the 7th level of the body refinement realm. Tianyang was just a piece of trash who had luckily reached the 5th level of the body refinement realm. How dare he provoke him, Bai Lu, in terms of qi and blood? If you can't compare to my 10 feet, then kneel down obediently and kowtow 3 times respectfully. Then, hand over the treasure to me. Otherwise, don't blame me for being merciless. Bai Lu sneered. Hearing this, Tianyang was slightly taken aback. Then, he couldn't help but laugh involuntarily. This Bai Lu wanted to compete with him in terms of qi and blood? Although his cultivation resources weren't as plentiful as Bai Lu's, the body refinement fist technique he cultivated was much stronger than Bai Lu's. Even if he didn't cultivate to the 9 refined dragon body, it was still extremely strong. Is this a bet? Tianyang chuckled. If I don't reach 30 meters of qi and blood, then I'll do as you said. Then, if I do, will you also do as you said? Kneel down and kowtow 3 times? As for the treasure, I'm sorry, but your treasure isn't worth my attention. A faint voice sounded. Hearing this, Bai Lu's face suddenly turned ugly. Not only did this piece of trash not obediently follow his orders, he even dared to talk to him directly? What right did a piece of trash have to talk to him directly? However, when he thought of the treasure in Tianyang's hands that allowed him to enter the martial path and increase his strength, as well as the treasure that allowed him to go from a piece of trash to the 5th level of the body refinement realm in just a few days, Bai Lu's heart burned with passion. If he could obtain such a treasure, wouldn't the number 1 position in the outer sect be within his reach? Is Tianyang courting death? He still wants to bargain with senior brother Bai Lu? Moreover, with his appearance, it's already not bad that he can release his qi and blood. I'm afraid he can't even reach 10 meters. This guy is probably trying his luck. There's going to be a good show later. At this time, 10 meters away from the 3 of them, 2 young men sneered. They were Tianyang's neighbors, but as neighbors, they didn't support Tianyang at all. Instead, they wanted to see Tianyang make a fool of himself. Tianyang naturally couldn't be bothered with these 2 people. His gaze met Bai Lu's and he chuckled. What's wrong? Could it be that the top 10 genius disciple of the outer sect is scared of a piece of trash like me? Hearing the last 2 words, Bai Lu's face twitched. The gaze he used to look at Tianyang became even colder. Later, not only would he make Tianyang kneel down and kowtow, he would also tear off his mouth. Let's bet then. What do I, Bai Lu, have to fear? Chapter 19. Let's bet then. What do I, Bai Lu, have to fear? Bai Lu sneered. In his opinion, Tianyang, who had never cultivated any powerful martial techniques, could not be compared to him, an outer disciple, even if he had obtained some body-refining fist techniques from the Tian family. Moreover, he, Bai Lu, had cultivation resources that Tianyang could not compare to. Just by smashing blood qi pills, he could produce a blood qi that was dozens of feet long. Furthermore, his talent was not bad either. You're just a piece of trash who relied on treasures to be arrogant for a while. Things like blood qi cannot be improved by treasures. This trash will die without a doubt. Bai Lu sneered in his heart and took a few steps back. What? Didn't you say you were going to release your blood qi? I've even given up my position for you. What? You can't release it? Hearing this, Tianyang chuckled. He raised his head and looked at Bai Lu with pity. This guy probably did not know how powerful the Tong Ming fist had become after he had modified it in his previous life. Although there was no need for such a basic fist technique to be ranked, Tianyang had a guess. The current Tong Ming fist was already comparable to an Earth rank martial technique. Moreover, as his strength increased, he would further modify the Tong Ming fist. The rank of the Tong Ming fist would also increase. As for the divine desolate heaven spirit art, although it was powerful, it was not completed. It was not easy to determine its rank. Tianyang himself was not a professional. It was already good enough that he could deduce its rank. Since you insist on seeking death, I won't let you down. Open your dog eyes and take a look. Tianyang smiled faintly. Then, in the spiral meridians in his body, his true yuan began to circulate slowly. The terrifying blood qi that was like an ancient beast was slowly released, 1 inch, 1 foot. In the blink of an eye, a diameter of 5 feet was revealed. Humph, you're only fast at the beginning. Pretending to be strong, but in reality you're just a piece of trash. Seeing the speed at which the blood qi was expanding, Bai Lu was slightly shocked. He then snorted coldly and thought to himself. After a few seconds, the diameter of the blood qi had successfully broken through 3 feet. 1 zhang, 2 zhang, 3 zhang. Tianyang's blood qi didn't slow down even when he was a third of Bai Lu's blood qi. Seeing this, Bai Lu's expression gradually turned ugly. This Tianyang actually had so much blood qi? Impossible. He had never heard of any treasure that could directly increase a person's vitality. One had to know that even the vitality pill could only be used as a supplement. There was no way it could increase one's strength. In reality, this was indeed the case. Most of the treasures that had an effect on the refinement realm weren't anything good. Vitality was a very mysterious thing, so it was naturally impossible for there to be any low-level treasures that could increase vitality. However, Heaven Continent was vast and boundless. Even though Tianyang was the Tianji Sword Emperor in his previous life, he didn't dare to say that he had traveled through the entire continent. Perhaps there really was such a thing in some corner of the continent. However, Bai Lu was not fated to know. 7 zhang, 8 zhang, 9 zhang. At this point, the speed at which the blood qi was expanding finally slowed down a little. However, in the next moment, Bai Lu watched in disbelief as the blood qi around Tianyang successfully broke through to 30 meters. After reaching 30 meters, the true origin circulating in Tianyang's body paused slightly. He raised his head and flashed a radiant smile. Now, 30 meters and 4 inches. Then, Tianyang's finger moved slightly. Now, 30 meters and 5 inches. In the next moment, Tianyang suddenly took a step forward. Accompanied by a powerful sound, the blood qi around his body started to expand rapidly. 30 meters, 30 meters, 30 meters. Finally, 150 meters. Tianyang softly laughed. The 150 meters wide blood qi revolved around his body. It was as if he had walked out from a pile of corpses. The blood qi that did not contain any impurities faintly permeated the air. Compared to Bai Lu's turbid blood qi, it was many times stronger. An indistinct killing intent revolved within the blood qi. Tianyang's smile, in Bai Lu's eyes, became especially terrifying. 150 meters. Even the number 1 person only had about the same amount of blood qi. However, that person had already reached the 8th level of the body refinement realm. Tianyang had only just broken through to the 5th level of the body refinement realm, yet he already had such a valiant blood qi. If he advanced to the 9th level of the body refinement realm in the future, wouldn't his blood qi break through the horizon? When he thought of that, Bai Lu's face instantly darkened. In the body refinement realm, other than fighting, it basically had nothing to do with the martial spirit. Therefore, in the early stages of martial cultivation, the martial spirit's influence on the martial path wasn't too great. In the body refinement realm, what determined one's battle strength was one's cultivation, true yuan, and blood qi. The current Tianyang already has such a tyrannical blood qi. If he matures in the future, I'm afraid that even I won't be his opponent. Bai Lu's eyes flickered. Killing intent slowly rose from the bottom of his heart as he stared fixedly at Tianyang in front of him. 150 meters. Compared to your 100 meters, it seems to be quite a bit taller. Then, it's time to fulfill the bet. As Tianyang spoke, the corners of his mouth curled up into a trace of a smile. The true yuan within his body also started to slowly revolve. Hearing that, Bai Lu's face instantly twisted. A glint filled with killing intent flashed through his eyes. Then, the true yuan within his body revolved and he roared. Tianyang die! Mad Tiger Fist! As if there was a ferocious tiger roaring, a terrifying fist condensed with reddish-yellow true yuan ruthlessly rushed towards Tianyang. This mad tiger fist's violent and domineering intent was actually controlled by Bai Lu. Compared to Bai Xiang's mad tiger fist that was as soft as a kitten, this mad tiger fist was undoubtedly much stronger. Mad Tiger Fist, a superior yellow-rank martial skill. Tianyang's pupils slightly contracted as he clearly saw all of Bai Lu's movements. He also immediately determined the rank of the martial skill that Bai Xiang was using. The Mad Tiger Fist that Bai Xiang used didn't display even a fraction of this superior yellow-rank martial skill. It was only when Bai Lu completely used it that he was able to completely see the rank of this martial skill. A superior yellow-rank martial skill was something that only disciples with a higher status could cultivate. After all, a martial skill of this level could be considered top-notch in the outer court. Haha! I've cultivated this Mad Tiger Fist for close to a year, and I've already mastered it. Even if you rely on treasures to improve quickly, you still won't have the time to cultivate this martial skill. Obediently hand over the treasures. I knew that you would definitely not abide by the bet. Tianyang snorted coldly as the fine steel sword at his waist abruptly shot out and landed in his hand with a loud clang. A sharp cold light flashed by. In the next instant, Tianyang's voice slowly rang out. I've just comprehended the flowing cloud sword. Then I'll use you to test my sword. Chapter 20. The reddish-yellow fist whistled through the air. At the same time, the fine steel sword, which shone with a cold light, also attacked. Fine steel sword. Bai Lu was slightly taken aback. Then, he snorted coldly. It's just a sword that I can shatter with one punch. You're actually using it to fight me? So what if your blood qi is strong? Your weapon has already been shattered by me. In that case, there's no need to fight anymore. Tianyang die. Tianyang laughed heartily. Shatter with one punch? Then let's try it. In the next moment, the Mad Tiger Fist and the fine steel sword fiercely collided. Bang! A deafening explosion instantly rang out. At the side, the heavily injured Bai Xiang couldn't help but take a few steps back from the terrifying shockwave. He looked at the center of the battle in disbelief. Bai Lu's Mad Tiger Fist had been comprehended to the initial stage. Being able to cultivate a martial skill of this level to the initial stage was enough for him to enter the top 10 of the outer court disciples. On the other hand, although Tianyang's blood qi was strong, a sword wasn't a weapon suitable for using blood qi. Moreover, Tianyang's true origin was only at the 5th level of the body refinement realm. Compared to Bai Lu's 7th level of the body refinement realm, the difference was incomparably huge. And the result? The roaring tiger was like a duck that had its throat grabbed. The ferocious roar from before had disappeared at this moment, and the right fist had strangely stopped in midair. Tianyang's expression didn't change at all. The fine steel sword in his hand trembled slightly. Instantly, the reddish-yellow true origin scattered in all directions like an eggshell that had been smashed. The Mad Tiger Fist was broken just like that? How is this possible? Bai Lu's pupils constricted when he saw this. The fine steel sword, which he could normally shatter with one punch without using any martial skills, was actually not damaged at all after receiving his Mad Tiger Fist? Moreover, Tianyang's attack had even broken his Mad Tiger Fist. Bai Lu clenched his teeth as he looked at Tianyang. The killing intent in his eyes became even more resolute. Tianyang was already so strong now. In the future, he would definitely be incredible. So what if you broke my Mad Tiger Fist? What happened before was just a warm-up. Now my true killing move. Bai Lu snorted coldly and suddenly took a step back. The true origin in his body started condensing. The aura of the seventh level of the body refinement realm pervaded the air. Just by feeling this aura, Bai Xiang's face instantly paled and he retreated a few steps. This was the suppression of levels. Bai Lu. You. With a maniacal laugh, Bai Lu's figure suddenly disappeared. In the next moment, he threw a punch filled with ferocious power at Tian Yang's face. Another loud tiger's roar. This time, however, it was much stronger than the mad tiger fist. It was the same reddish-yellow true origin, but the tiger's roar was much stronger than the mad tiger fist. Bai Lu sneered inwardly. Tian Yang was courting death by going against him. Now, he was just waiting to be smashed into meat paste by his fist. Flowing cloud sword technique. Tian Yang's playful expression turned serious. After all, the difference in rank was difficult to make up for. This fist was even more extraordinary. In his opinion, the tiger's roar was definitely an upgraded version of the mad tiger fist. Although it wasn't at the mystic stage, it was at least half a step away from the mystic stage. The steel sword in his hand seemed to become more illusory. When he waved it, it created afterimages. Then, the cloud-like fine steel sword arrived in front of the fist. Seeing this, Bai Lu laughed maniacally. Feudal resistance. Boom. The tiger's roar collided with the flowing cloud sword technique. The tiger roared crazily, and Heavenly Sun's sword seemed to contain flowing clouds. It retracted and released like flowing water, without any obstruction. The reddish-yellow true origin surged wildly. Bai Lu's expression changed drastically. The tiger's roar couldn't do anything to Tianyang? Tiger's roar break. Tianyang die. Bai Lu roared furiously. Almost all of the remaining true energy in his body condensed in his right fist. His tyrannical power also started to grow. Beside him, Bai Xiang's pale face flushed red. Big brother is going all out. Tianyang is dead for sure this time. The power of each strike wasn't too strong, but when they overlapped, the power would reach an incomparably terrifying level. This was the concept of the flowing cloud sword technique. The strike was vast and difficult to find. The strike was like flowing water. The strike was like flowing water. The strike was like flowing water. In an extremely short period of time, the sword would strike again. In just a few seconds, Tianyang's arm had waved countless times. No matter how strong Bai Lu's tiger's roar was, at this moment, there was only one word to describe it. Defeat. Boom. The reddish-yellow tiger's roar instantly exploded. When the first strike was made, the tiger's roar had already shown signs of collapsing. After the second strike, the fist was only maintained by inertia. When the third strike, the tiger's roar completely collapsed. However, Tianyang's sword was bound to see blood. The reddish-yellow true origin fragments scattered wildly in the surroundings. Before they fell to the ground, they became the abundant energy of the heavens and earth due to the looseness of their bodies. The layer of flowing clouds on the fine steel sword, under the support of qi, turned into an incomparably sharp blade. It gently fell towards the fist that was no longer protected by any qi. Without any obstruction, the steel sword slid down without any pause. However, blood splattered everywhere. My fist! Bai Lu screamed. His left wrist had already turned into a blood-spurting device. The cut surface was smooth, and Tianyang's true origin was still on it. On the grass, a clenched fist with loosened fingers was lying quietly on the grass. The blood on it was slowly dissipating as blood flowed out of it. There were pills that could regenerate broken limbs, but they definitely weren't something that a person of Bai Lu's status could obtain. Tianyang, I want you dead! Bai Lu roared. His eyes were bloodshot. His fist was gone just like that. Regardless of whether it was him or the family behind him, it was impossible for them to obtain such a miraculous elixir. This meant that from now on, he could only be a cripple without a fist. His incomparably arrogant heart couldn't accept this at all. A violet light suddenly flickered from behind Bai Lu, and in the next moment, A ferocious violet python appeared behind him. Chapter 21. Martial Spirit, Purple Python. The shadow of a giant purple python leaped out from behind Bai Lu. Then, it stretched out its huge tail and wrapped Bai Lu in it, slowly circling around Bai Lu. Its emotionless yellow vertical pupils flickered with a dangerous light. Its slightly open mouth revealed two huge fangs that made one's heart turn cold. With just a glance, Tianyang's two neighbors couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines as they sucked in a breath of cold air. Bai Lu was actually forced to use his martial spirit. The purple python was a type of magical beast. It was born as a first-rank magical beast, and its battle strength was equivalent to a body refinement stage cultivator. Moreover, it was a high-grade yellow-rank magical beast. Even in the entire outer sect, it was rare to see a martial spirit of this level. Most of the disciples had a mid-grade yellow-rank martial spirit, while a small number had a low-grade yellow-rank martial spirit. A martial spirit was a cultivator's trump card. Under normal circumstances, apart from a few special martial spirits, it wouldn't be used easily. After all, once a martial spirit was activated, the spiritual energy would be rapidly consumed, and the spiritual energy would be difficult to recover. However, Tianyang's spiritual energy at the peak of the heavenly completion stage was too terrifying. That was why he was able to use it as soon as he awakened it. However, when the spiritual energy was consumed, the power that was exchanged for it was naturally incomparably terrifying. The magnitude of this power was determined by the martial spirit's rank. A low-grade yellow-rank martial spirit definitely couldn't compare to a high-grade yellow-rank martial spirit. Of course, Tianyang's Skycloud sword was an exception. If it weren't for the fact that there were people watching the battle, Tianyang would have immediately activated his martial spirit and devoured the incomparably huge purple python in front of him. If he had devoured this purple python, then his Skycloud sword would have at least reached the peak of the low-grade yellow rank. However, although the Skycloud sword was only a low-grade yellow-rank martial spirit, its true power wasn't the slightest bit inferior to a mid-grade yellow-rank martial spirit. Haha! My martial spirit is a high-grade yellow-rank martial spirit. Compared to your low-grade yellow-rank trash martial spirit, it's countless times stronger. Bai Luzheng laughed maniacally as he looked at the frowning Tianyang. His eyes were filled with contempt and hatred. Originally, if you had obediently handed over the treasure, I, Bai Lu, would have spared your life. However, you trash, you actually dared to break my fist. So die. Bai Lu roared angrily. Then, the true essence in his body circulated rapidly. He stomped on the ground, and his body became much more illusory. In the next moment, a sharp wind from his finger pierced toward Tianyang. Purple prick! The purple python suddenly opened its mouth and shot out a beam of purple light together with Bai Lu's purple spike. Then, they fused into one in midair. Do you really think that you're invincible just because you have an upper yellow-ranked martial spirit? With a light snort, Tianyang's fine steel sword flashed and he also activated his martial soul. Due to the heavenly sword's grade, it could not materialize into a physical body. Just like the purple python, the grass snake, and the boxing gloves, they were only illusions. However, after the heavenly sword's illusions merged with the fine steel sword, the fine steel sword's power would be greatly increased. Since I can't devour it completely, I'll devour a little bit of you as interest. With a cold snort, Tianyang abruptly raised the long sword in his hand in the face of the rapidly approaching purple light spike. A white beam of light flashed by. Basic sword technique, upward slash. What was supposed to be an extremely basic sword move was now miraculous in Tianyang's hands. He directly targeted the purple spike's weak point and destroyed it with a single slash. Humph! Seeing this, Bai Lu's pupils constricted and he snorted. You dare to be so arrogant after breaking my casual attack? Since that's the case, you'll pay for my left hand with your life. Bai Lu's figure became erratic as he used his movement skill again. Seeing this, Tianyang's expression did not change. His eyes kept darting around. No matter how good your movement skill is, under the Tianji Sword Emperor's gaze, there was nothing you could do. Nothing could be hidden from him. Basic sword technique, immortal shows the way. He suddenly took a step to the left. In an instant, a hidden purple beam of light passed through where Tianyang was standing. At this time, Tianyang's sword had already pierced towards Bai Lu. How is this possible? Bai Lu's incomparably hidden move had been easily dodged by Tianyang. It was as if everything was under his control. Bai Lu's expression changed drastically. He hastily raised his hand and retreated a few steps before he managed to block the attack. However, on his bare right wrist, the wound that had been hastily sealed was once again spurting out blood. Bastard! Tianyang, you deserve to die! An incomparably sharp pain was transmitted directly to Bai Lu's brain. His face twisted. Bai Lu roared angrily, his veins bulging. The true origin in his body was madly circulating. The purple python behind him seemed to be affected by its master and began to roar towards the sky. In the next moment, Bai Lu's figure charged towards Tianyang. Is the victor going to be decided? Seeing that Bai Lu did not have much true origin left in his body, Tianyang chuckled. From the start of the battle until now, he had only used a few moves of the flowing cloud sword technique and a few basic sword technique. Although the true origin in his body was not completely depleted, he still had about 70 to 80% left. Compared to Bai Lu, who had less than 20% left, it was like heaven and earth. Tianyang, die. Purple python martial soul. Purple poison corrodes bone. Bai Lu was like a madman. His eyes were crimson red. In the next moment, he gathered all his true origin and soul power and struck out with his palm. The purple python behind Bai Lu's back had also left his body and merged with his palm. The purple light that made people feel uncomfortable just by looking at it slowly circulated around Bai Lu's palm. This halo was a poison exclusive to the purple python martial soul. Once a body refinement realm cultivator came into contact with this poison, they would definitely die. In the past, one of the top 10 outer disciples had been ambushed by Bai Lu when he was training in the mountains. After that, he had been poisoned to death by the bone-corroding poison. From Bai Lu's point of view, Tianyang would not be better than the former 9th outer disciple. Since you've already used your ultimate move, I won't continue playing with you. With a chuckle, Tianyang's steel sword flashed a few times. In the next moment, the true origin in his body surged out like a real dragon. In the next moment, the sword, which was as powerful as a flowing cloud, collided with Bai Lu's purple poison corroding bone palm. Flowing cloud sword technique. Sword from flowing cloud. It was as if there were flowing clouds around Tianyang's body. In the next moment, a deafening explosion resounded through the clouds. Pfft! Bai Lu spat out a mouthful of blood. In the next moment, his body was sent flying like a cannonball. The purple halo was also scattered. Tianyang chuckled. Crack. Chapter 22. Bang. Bai Lu's body landed heavily on the ground, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were fixed on Tianyang, who was gradually approaching him. However, he felt as if his internal organs were burning, and it was extremely uncomfortable. Not long after, Bai Lu couldn't take it anymore. His eyelids rolled up and he fainted. Nearly half of the bones in his body were cracked, and the bones in his left hand, which had suffered the most direct attack from the fine steel sword, were broken inch by inch. Even if Bai Lu woke up, he would only be a cripple. No one would have thought that Bai Lu, who had come aggressively to kill Tianyang, would be lying unconscious on the ground like a dead dog. Even his life was in Tianyang's hands. The fine steel sword in his hand flashed, and Tianyang retrieved the sky cloud sword. In the instant the purple python collapsed, the sky firmament sword had also successfully absorbed some of the martial spirit's energy. It had also strengthened the sky firmament sword martial spirit, which was originally only a low-grade yellow-ranked martial spirit. However, although the purple python martial spirit was a high-grade yellow-rank martial spirit, it was still difficult for it to increase the grade of the sky cloud sword. Moreover, in the presence of so many people, Tianyang couldn't possibly reveal his ability to devour other people's martial spirit. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to stay in the Lingyun sect. In the current sky continent, the most important thing for a martial artist was the martial spirit. However, if someone who could devour other people's martial spirits appeared, then countless experts with martial spirits would definitely kill him. Tisk. Feeling that the sky cloud sword had become stronger, Tianyang was still somewhat dissatisfied. Although the purple python martial spirit was weak, it was better than nothing. It was a pity that there were too many people around. Not to mention Bai Xiang, who was so shocked that he almost died. There were two trembling neighbors in the distance. If Tianyang wanted to kill them, it would be troublesome. His current cultivation was still too weak. What? You said that the Lingyun sect had a rule that prohibited disciples from killing each other? What a joke. When Bai Lu said that he wanted to kill Tianyang, did he even consider this? The top 10 outer disciples had special privileges that ordinary disciples did not have. However, if it was the other way around, it would be different. Bai Lu's ugly deeds had not been exposed yet. If Tianyang killed him, the Soaring Cloud sect would only regard Tianyang as the person who killed their genius disciple, and not Tianyang as an even stronger genius. At the end of the day, it was still a matter of strength. The Lingyun sect could not be blamed. Why aren't you guys scramming? He stretched out his leg and kicked Bai Lu's unconscious body away. Then, he indifferently glanced at the people around him. Immediately, even Bai Lu's younger brother, Bai Xiang, was scared witless and immediately left. He had completely forgotten that his elder brother was still lying there. The two people who had mocked Tianyang before didn't dare to stay for even a moment. They were afraid that Tianyang, who could defeat Bai Lu, would kill them as well. They were not in the top 10 of the outer sect. Among the hundreds of outer sect disciples in the Lingyun sect, they could only be considered average. If Tianyang killed them, they would not even have a place to cry. What a disappointment! Tianyang unhappily snorted. He was too lazy to care about Bai Lu's corpse on the ground. After throwing him to the side, he leisurely returned to the house. Bai Lu was just a small interlude. The most important thing was still the 9 refined dragon body. It wasn't that Tianyang didn't have a low heaven rank martial skill. As the Tianji Sword Emperor, the Tianji Sword art he used was a mid-heaven rank martial skill. However, the Tianji Sword art's requirement for the cultivator's strength was still a bit too high. Even if Tianyang himself, who had created the Tianji Sword art, wanted to cultivate it, he would have to at least enter the Clear Qi realm, or even the higher transformed origin realm. After all, a mid-heaven rank martial skill was really too strong. However, the 9-tempered dragon body of heaven rank might be an opportunity. 9 refined dragon body, low heaven rank martial skill. It was created by the crimson dragon Wu Zun in the ancient times. He had an unparalleled strength and was invincible in the sky continent. The 9 refined dragon body is the most famous skill of the crimson dragon Wu Zun. It is a body refining martial skill that he created after his cultivation reached the great success level and his understanding of the heavenly way reached the pinnacle. He read the introduction of the 9 refined dragon body in a low voice. He admired the crimson dragon Wu Zun in the ancient times. In the ancient times, it wasn't the human clan that ruled the sky continent. On the contrary, it was the dragon clan, the phoenix clan and other powerful demonic beast clans that ruled the continent. The human clan was just a small race among them. However, the crimson dragon Wu Zun slaughtered dragons and phoenixes in the face of adversity. He used the blood of those powerful demonic beasts to achieve his own Tao. Although he didn't lead the human clan to become the overlord of the sky continent, he was still an extremely tyrannical existence. However, unlike Tianyang, who went through the heavenly tribulation when he reached the peak of the heavenly completion stage, the Crimson Dragon Wu Zun couldn't resist the call of the heavenly way when he reached the late stage of the heavenly completion stage. He went through the heavenly tribulation and ascended to another world. He's also a senior, although I might be stronger than him. Sighing lightly, Tianyang skimmed through the introduction of the Crimson Dragon Wu Zun on the scroll he obtained from the historical remains and flipped to the very beginning of his cultivation. I, the Crimson Dragon Wu Zun, was originally a mortal. However, by chance, I obtained the blood essence of the Crimson Dragon and refined the blood essence of the Crimson Dragon, achieving the Tao of the True Dragon. When I reached the late stage of the heavenly completion stage, I comprehended the great Tao and created the 9 refined dragon body. I hope that my successors won't disgrace the name of I, the Crimson Dragon Wu Zun. The 9 refined dragon body is divided into 9 refinements. If the first refinement is completed in the body refining stage, one will obtain the qi and blood of the peak of the 7 refined dragon body. The second refinement, if one reaches the 9th refinement, one's body will possess the power of the 9 dragons, suppressing the ages and sweeping the world. It's a pity that although I created the 9 refined dragon body, I also realized that the 9th refinement is far from the limit of this technique. I hope that my successors will be able to surpass me and truly display the mysteries of the 9 refined dragon body. Although this was merely Tianyang's memories of the 9 refined dragon body and not the actual scroll of the 9 refined dragon body, the domineering aura that belonged to the ancient Wu Zun was still displayed between the lines. Seeing this, Tianyang couldn't help but click his tongue in admiration. As expected of an ancient heavenly completion stage expert. Then let me see how strong this 9 refined dragon body is. The first refinement. Using the blood essence of thousands of magical beasts, open the 9 meridians in the body. Large, domineering words appeared on the crimson scroll in his memories. Seeing this, the corners of Tianyang's mouth twitched slightly. Opening meridians? That's all right. Although spiral meridians are spiral meridians, the difficulty of opening meridians is greatly increased, but it's still possible. However, the blood essence of thousands of magical beasts?